Chapter 16 of The Little White Bird. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rose Hip. The Little White Bird by J.M. Barrie. Chapter 16. Lockout Time. It is frightfully difficult to know much about the fairies, and almost the only thing known for certain is that there are fairies wherever there are children. Long ago, children were forbidden the gardens, and at that time there was not a fairy in the place. Then the children were admitted, and the fairies came trooping in that very evening. They can't resist following the children, but you seldom see them, partly because they live in the daytime behind the railings, where you are not allowed to go, and also partly because they are so cunning. They are not a bit cunning after lockout, but until lockout, my word. When you were a bird you knew the fairies pretty well, and you remember a good deal about them in your babyhood, which it is a great pity you can't write down, for gradually you forget, and I have heard of children who declared that they had never once seen a fairy. Very likely, if they said this in the Kensington Gardens, they were standing looking at a fairy all the time. The reason they were cheated was that she pretended to be something else. This is one of their best tricks. They usually pretend to be flowers, because the court sits in the fairies' basin, and there are so many flowers there, and all along the baby walk, that a flower is the thing least likely to attract attention. They dress exactly like flowers, and change with the seasons, putting on white when lilies are in, and blue for bluebells, and so on. They like crocus and hyacinth time best of all, as they are partial to a bit of colour, but tulips, except white ones, which are the fairy cradles, they consider garish, and they sometimes put off dressing like tulips for days, so that the beginning of the tulip weeks is almost the best time to catch them. When they think you are not looking, they skip along pretty lively, but if you look, and they fear there is no time to hide, they stand quite still, pretending to be flowers. Then, after you have passed without knowing that they were fairies, they rush home and tell their mothers they have had such an adventure. The fairy basin, you remember, is all covered with ground ivy, from which they make their castor oil, with flowers growing in it here and there. Most of them really are flowers, but some of them are fairies. You never can be sure of them, but a good plan is to walk by looking the other way, and then turn round sharply. Another good plan, which David and I sometimes follow, is to stare them down. After a long time they can't help winking, and then you know for certain that they are fairies. There are also numbers of them along the baby walk, which is a famous gentle place, as spots frequented by fairies are called. Once 24 of them had an extraordinary adventure. They were a girls' school out for a walk with the governess, and all wearing hyacinth gowns, when she suddenly put her finger to her mouth, and then they all stood still on an empty bed and pretended to be hyacinths. Unfortunately, what the governess had heard was 2 gardeners coming to plant new flowers in that very bed. They were wheeling a hand-cart with the flowers in it, and were quite surprised to find the bed occupied. "Pity to lift them hyacinths," said the one man. "Duke's orders," replied the other, and having emptied the cart, they dug up the boarding school and put the poor terrified things in it in 5 rows. Of course, neither the governess nor the girls dare let on that they were fairies, so they were carted far away to a potting shed, out of which they escaped in the night without their shoes, but there was a great row about it among the parents, and the school was ruined. As for their houses, it is no use looking for them, because they are the exact opposite of our houses. You can see our houses by day, but you can't see them by dark. Well, you can see their houses by dark, but you can't see them by day, for they are the colour of night, and I never heard of anyone yet who could see night in the daytime. This does not mean that they are black, for night has its colours just as day has, but ever so much brighter. Their blues and reds and greens are like ours, with a light behind them. The palace is entirely built of many-coloured glasses, and is quite the loveliest of all royal residences, but the Queen sometimes complains because the common people will peep in to see what she is doing. They are very inquisitive folk, and press quite hard against the glass, and that is why their noses are mostly snubby. The streets are miles long and very twisty, and have paths on each side made of bright worsted. The birds used to steal the worsted for their nests, but a policeman has been appointed to hold on at the other end. One of the great differences between the fairies and us is that they never do anything useful. When the first baby laughed for the first time, his laugh broke into 1,000,000 pieces, and they all went skipping about. That was the beginning of fairies. They look tremendously busy, you know, as if they had not a moment to spare, but if you were to ask them what they are doing, they could not tell you in the least. They are frightfully ignorant, and everything they do is make-believe. They have a postman, but he never calls except at Christmas with his little box, and though they have beautiful schools, nothing is taught in them. The youngest child, being chief person, is always elected mistress, and when she has called the roll, they all go out for a walk and never come back. It is a very noticeable thing that, in fairy families, the youngest is always chief person, and usually becomes a prince or princess. And children remember this, and think it must be so among humans also, and that is why they are often made uneasy when they come upon their mother furtively putting new frills on the bassinet. You have probably observed that your baby sister wants to do all sorts of things that your mother and her nurse want her not to do. To stand up at sitting down time, and to sit down at standing up time, for instance, or to wake up when she should fall asleep, or to crawl on the floor when she's wearing her best frock, and so on, and perhaps you put this down to naughtiness. But it is not. It simply means that she is doing as she has seen the fairies do. She begins by following their ways, and it takes about 2 years to get her into the human ways. Her fits of passion, which are awful to behold, and are usually called teething, are no such thing. They are her natural exasperation, because we don't understand her, though she is talking an intelligible language. She is talking fairy. The reason mothers and nurses know what her remarks mean before other people know, as that "Gutch" means "give it to me at once," while "Wah" is "why do you wear such a funny hat?" is because, mixing so much with babies, they have picked up a little of the fairy language. Of late David has been thinking back hard about the fairy tongue, with his hands clutching his temples, and he has remembered a number of their phrases, which I shall tell you some day if I don't forget. He had heard them in the days when he was a thrush, and though I suggested to him that perhaps it is really bird language he is remembering, he says not, for these phrases are about fun and adventures, and the birds talked of nothing but nest-building. He distinctly remembers that the birds used to go from spot to spot, like ladies at shop windows, looking at the different nests and saying, "Not my colour, my dear. and "How would that do with a soft lining?" and "But will it wear?" and "What hideous trimming?" and so on. The fairies are exquisite dancers, and that is why one of the first things the baby does is to sign to you to dance to him, and then to cry when you do it. They hold their great balls in the open air in what is called a fairy ring. For weeks afterward you can see the ring on the grass. It is not there when they begin, but they make it by waltzing round and round. Sometimes you will find mushrooms inside the ring, and these are fairy chairs that the servants have forgotten to clear away. The chairs and the rings are the only telltale marks these little people leave behind them, and they would remove even these were they not so fond of dancing that they tow it till the very moment of the opening of the gates. David and I once found a fairy ring quite warm. But there is also a way of finding out about the ball before it takes place. You know the boards which tell at what time the gardens are to close today? Well, these tricky fairies sometimes slyly change the board on a ball night so that it says the gardens are to close at 6:30, for instance, instead of at 7. This enables them to get begun half an hour earlier. If on such a night we could remain behind in the gardens, as the famous Mamie Mannering did, we might see delicious sights. Hundreds of lovely fairies hastening to the ball, the married ones wearing their wedding rings round their waists, the gentlemen all in uniform holding up the ladies' trains, and linkmen running in front carrying winter cherries, which are the fairy lanterns, the cloakroom where they put on their silver slippers and get a ticket for their wraps, the flowers streaming up from the baby walk to look on, and always welcome because they can lend a pin, the supper table, with Queen Mab at the head of it, and behind her chair the Lord Chamberlain, who carries a dandelion on which he blows when Her Majesty wants to know the time. The tablecloth varies according to the seasons, and in May it is made of chestnut blossom. The ways the fairy servants do is this. The men, scores of them, climb up the trees and shake the branches, and the blossom falls like snow. Then the lady servants sweep it together by whisking their skirts until it is exactly like a tablecloth, and that is how they get their tablecloth. They have real glasses and real wine of 3 kinds, namely blackthorn wine, berberis wine, and cowslip wine, and the Queen pours out, but the bottles are so heavy that she just pretends to pour out. There is bread and butter to begin with, of the size of a 3-penny bit, and cakes to end with, and they are so small that they have no crumbs. The fairies sit round on mushrooms, and at first they are very well behaved and always cough off the table, and so on, but after a bit they are not so well behaved, and stick their fingers into the butter, which is got from the roots of old trees, and the really horrid ones crawl over the tablecloth, chasing sugar or other delicacies with their tongues. When the Queen sees them doing this, she signs to the servants to wash up and put away, and then everybody adjourns to the dance, the Queen walking in front, while the Lord Chamberlain walks behind her, carrying 2 little pots, one of which contains the juice of wallflower, and the other the juice of Solomon's seals. Wallflower juice is good for reviving dancers who fall to the ground in a fit, and Solomon's seals juice is for bruises. They bruise very easily, and when Peter plays faster and faster, they foot it till they fall down in fits. For, as you know without my telling you, Peter Pan is the fairies' orchestra. He sits in the middle of the ring, and they would never dream of having a smart dance nowadays without him. P.P. is written on the corner of the invitation cards sent out by all really good families. They are grateful little people too, and at the Princess's coming-of-age ball (they come of age on their 2nd birthday, and have a birthday every month) they gave him the wish of his heart. The way it was done was this. The Queen ordered him to kneel, and then said that for playing so beautifully she would give him the wish of his heart. Then they all gathered round Peter to hear what was the wish of his heart. But for a long time he hesitated, not being certain what it was himself. "If I chose to go back to Mother," he asked at last, "could you give me that wish?" Now this question vexed them, for were he to return to his mother they should lose his music. So the Queen tilted her nose contemptuously and said, "Pooh! Ask for a much bigger wish than that." "Is that quite a little wish?" he inquired. "As little as this," the Queen answered, putting her hands near each other. "What size is a big wish?" he asked. She measured it off on her skirt, and it was a very handsome length. Then Peter reflected and said, "Well, then, I think I shall have 2 little wishes instead of 1 big one." Of course the fairies had to agree, though his cleverness rather shocked them, and he said that his first wish was to go to his mother, but with the right to return to the gardens if he found her disappointing. His second wish he would hold in reserve. They tried to dissuade him, and even put obstacles in the way. "I can give you the power to fly to her house," the Queen said, "but I can't open the door for you." "The window I flew out at will be open," Peter said confidently. "Mother always keeps it open in the hope that I may fly back." "How do you know?" they asked, quite surprised. And really Peter could not explain how he knew. "I just do know," he said. So as he persisted in his wish, they had to grant it. The way they gave him power to fly was this. They all tickled him on the shoulder, and soon he felt a funny itching in that part, and then up he rose higher and higher, and flew away out of the gardens and over the housetops. It was so delicious that instead of flying straight to his old home, he skimmed away over St. Paul's to the Crystal Palace, and back by the river and Regent's Park, and by the time he reached his mother's window he had quite made up his mind that his second wish should be to become a bird. The window was wide open, just as he knew it would be, and in he fluttered, and there was his mother lying asleep. Peter alighted softly on the wooden rail at the foot of the bed and had a good look at her. She lay with her head on her hand, and the hollow in the pillow was like a nest lined with her brown wavy hair. He remembered, though he had long forgotten it, that she always gave her hair a holiday at night. How sweet the frills of her nightgown were! He was very glad she was such a pretty mother. But she looked sad, and he knew why she looked sad. One of her arms moved as if it wanted to go round something, and he knew what it wanted to go round. "Oh, Mother," said Peter to himself, "if you just knew who is sitting on the rail at the foot of the bed." Very gently he patted the little mound that her feet made, and he could see by her face that she liked it. He knew he had but to say "Mother" ever so softly, and she would wake up. They always wake up at once if it is you that says their name. Then she would give such a joyous cry and squeeze him tight. How nice that would be to him, but oh, how exquisitely delicious it would be to her. That, I am afraid, is how Peter regarded it. In returning to his mother he never doubted that he was giving her the greatest treat a woman can have. Nothing can be more splendid, he thought, than to have a little boy of your own. How proud of him they are, and very right and proper too. But why does Peter sit so long on the rail? Why does he not tell his mother that he has come back? I quite shrink from the truth, which is that he sat there in 2 minds. Sometimes he looked longingly at his mother, and sometimes he looked longingly at the window. Certainly it would be pleasant to be her boy again, but, on the other hand, what times those had been in the gardens! Was he so sure that he would enjoy wearing clothes again? He popped off the bed and opened some drawers to have a look at his old garments. They were still there, but he could not remember how you put them on. The socks, for instance. Were they worn on the hands or on the feet? He was about to try one of them on his hand when he had a great adventure. Perhaps the drawer had creaked. At any rate, his mother woke up, for he heard her say, "Peter," as if it was the most lovely word in the language. He remained sitting on the floor and held his breath, wondering how she knew that he had come back. If she said Peter again, he meant to cry mother and run to her. But she spoke no more. She made little moans only, and when next he peeped at her, she was once more asleep, with tears on her face. It made Peter very miserable, and what do you think was the first thing he did? Sitting on the rail at the foot of the bed, he played a beautiful lullaby to his mother on his pipe. He had made it up himself out of the way she said Peter, and he never stopped playing until she looked happy. He thought this so clever of him that he could scarcely resist wakening her to hear her say, "Oh, Peter, how exquisitely you play!" However, as she now seemed comfortable, he again cast looks at the window. You must not think that he meditated flying away and never coming back. He had quite decided to be his mother's boy, but hesitated about beginning tonight. It was the second wish which troubled him. He no longer meant to make it a wish to be a bird, but not to ask for a second wish seemed wasteful, and of course he could not ask for it without returning to the fairies. Also, if he put off asking for his wish too long, it might go bad. He asked himself if he had not been hard-hearted to fly away without saying good-bye to Solomon. "I should like awfully to sail in my boat just once more," he said wistfully to his sleeping mother. He quite argued with her as if she could hear him. "It would be so splendid to tell the birds of this adventure," he said coaxingly. "I promise to come back," he said solemnly, and meant it too. And in the end, you know, he flew away. Twice he came back from the window, wanting to kiss his mother, but he feared the delight of it might waken her, so at last he played her a lovely kiss on his pipe, and then he flew back to the gardens. Many nights and even months passed before he asked the fairies for his second wish, and I am not sure that I quite know why he delayed so long. One reason was that he had so many good-byes to say, not only to his particular friends, but to 100 favourite spots. Then he had his last sail, and his very last sail, and his last sail of all, and so on. Again, a number of farewell feasts were given in his honour, and another comfortable reason was that, after all, there was no hurry, for his mother would never weary of waiting for him. This last reason displeased old Solomon, for it was an encouragement to the birds to procrastinate. Solomon had several excellent mottos for keeping them at their work, such as, "Never put off laying today, because you can lay tomorrow," and "In this world there are no second chances." And yet here was Peter gaily putting off, and none the worse for it. The birds pointed this out to each other, and fell into lazy habits. But, mind you, though Peter was so slow in going back to his mother, he was quite decided to go back. The best proof of this was his caution with the fairies. They were most anxious that he should remain in the gardens to play to them, and to bring this to pass they tried to trick him into making such a remark as, "I wish the grass was not so wet," and some of them danced out of time in the hope that he might cry, "I do wish you would keep time." Then they would have said that this was his second wish. But he smoked their design, and though on occasions he began, "I wish," he always stopped in time. So when at last he said to them bravely, "I wish now to go back to mother for ever and always," they had to tickle his shoulders and let him go. He went in a hurry in the end, because he had dreamt that his mother was crying, and he knew what was the great thing she cried for, and that a hug from her splendid Peter would quickly make her to smile. Oh, he felt sure of it, and so eager was he to be nestling in her arms, that this time he flew straight to the window, which was always to be open for him. But the window was closed, and there were iron bars on it, and peering inside he saw his mother sleeping peacefully, with her arm round another little boy. Peter called, "Mother, mother," but she heard him not. In vain he beat his little limbs against the iron bars. He had to fly back, sobbing, to the gardens, and he never saw his dear again. What a glorious boy he had meant to be to her! Ah, Peter, we who have made the great mistake, how differently we should all act at the second chance. But Solomon was right. There is no second chance, not for most of us. When we reach the window, it is lock-out time. The iron bars are up for life. End of chapter.
Chapter 17 of The Little White Bird. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sandra. The Little White Bird by J.M. Barrie. Chapter 17. Chapter 17. The Little House. Everybody has heard of the little house in the Kensington Gardens, which is the only house in the whole world that the fairies have built for humans. But no one has really seen it, except just 3 or 4, and they have not only seen it, but slept in it, and unless you sleep in it, you never see it. This is because it is not there when you lie down, but it is there when you wake up and step outside. In a kind of way everyone may see it, but what you see is not really it, but only the light in the windows. You see the light after lock-out time. David, for instance, saw it quite distinctly far away among the trees as we were going home from the pantomime, and Oliver Bailey saw it the night he stayed so late at the Temple, which is the name of his father's office. Angela Clare, who loves to have a tooth extracted, because then she is treated to tea in a shop, saw more than one light. She saw hundreds of them altogether, and this must have been the fairies building the house, for they build it every night and always in a different part of the gardens. She thought one of the lights was bigger than the others, though she was not quite sure, for they jumped about so, and it might have been another one that was bigger. But if it was the same one, it was Peter Pan's light. Heaps of children have seen the light, so that is nothing. But Mamie Mannering was the famous one for whom the house was first built. Mamie was always rather a strange girl, and it was at night that she was strange. She was 4 years of age, and in the daytime she was the ordinary kind. She was pleased when her brother Tony, who was a magnificent fellow of 6, took notice of her, and she looked up to him in the right way, and tried in vain to imitate him, and was flattered rather than annoyed when he shoved her about. Also, when she was batting, she would pause, though the ball was in the air, to point out to you that she was wearing new shoes. She was quite the ordinary kind in the daytime. But as the shades of night fell, Tony, the swaggerer, lost his contempt for Mamie and eyed her fearfully, and no wonder, for with dark there came into her face a look that I can describe only as a leery look. It was also a serene look that contrasted grandly with Tony's uneasy glances. Then he would make her presents of his favourite toys, which he always took away from her next morning, and she accepted them with a disturbing smile. The reason he was now become so wheedling and she so mysterious was, in brief, that they knew they were about to be sent to bed. It was then that Mamie was terrible. Tony entreated her not to do it to-night, and the mother and their coloured nurse threatened her, but Mamie merely smiled her agitating smile, and by, when they were alone with their night-light, she would start up in bed crying, "Shh! What was that?" Tony beseeches her. "It was nothing. Don't, Mamie, don't," and pulls the sheet over his head. "It is coming nearer," she cries. "Oh, look at it, Tony. It is feeling your bed with its horns. It is boring for you. Oh, Tony, oh!" She desists not until he rushes downstairs in his combinations, screeching. When they came up to whip Mamie, they usually found her sleeping tranquilly, not shamming, you know, but really sleeping and looking like the sweetest little angel, which seems to me to make it almost worse. But of course it was daytime when they were in the gardens, and then Tony did most of the talking. You could gather from his talk that he was a very brave boy, and no one was so proud of it as Mamie. She would have loved to have a ticket on her saying that she was his sister, and at no time did she admire him more than when he told her, as he often did with splendid firmness, that one day he meant to remain behind in the gardens after the gates were closed. "Oh, Tony," she would say with awful respect, "but the fairies will be so angry." "I dare say," replied Tony carelessly. "Perhaps," she said, thrilling, "Peter Pan will give you a sail in his boat." "I shall make him," replied Tony. No wonder she was proud of him. But they should not have talked so loudly, for one day they were overheard by a fairy who had been gathering skeleton leaves, from which the little people weave their summer curtains, and after that Tony was a marked boy. They loosened the rails before he sat on them, so that down he came on the back of his head. They tripped him up by catching his bootlace, and bribed the ducks to sink his boat. Nearly all the nasty accidents you meet with in the gardens occur because the fairies have taken an ill will to you, and so it behoves you to be careful what you say about them. Mamie was one of the kind who liked to fix a day for doing things, but Tony was not that kind, and when she asked him which day he was to remain behind in the gardens after lock-out, he merely replied, "Just some day." He was quite vague about which day, except when she asked, "Will it be to-day?" and then he could always say for certain that it would not be to-day. So she saw that he was waiting for a real good chance. This brings us to an afternoon when the gardens were white with snow, and there was ice on the round pond. Not thick enough to skate on, but at least you could spoil it for to-morrow by flinging stones, and many bright little boys and girls were doing that. When Tony and his sister arrived, they wanted to go straight to the pond, but their ayah said they must take a sharp walk first, and as she said this she glanced at the time-board to see when the gardens closed that night. It read 5:30. Poor ayah! She is the one who laughs continuously because there are so many white children in the world, but she was not to laugh much more that day. Well, they went up the baby walk and back, and when they returned to the time-board, she was surprised to see that it now read 5 o'clock for closing time. But she was unacquainted with the tricky ways of the fairies, and so did not see, as Mamie and Tony saw at once that they had changed the hour because there was to be a ball to-night. She said there was only time now to walk to the top of the hump and back, and as they trotted along with her she little guessed what was thrilling their little breasts. You see, the chance had come of seeing a fairy ball. Never, Tony felt, could he hope for a better chance. He had to feel this, for Mamie so plainly felt it for him. Her eager eyes asked the question, "Is it to-day?" and he gasped and then nodded. Mamie slipped her hand into Tony's, and hers was hot, but his was cold. She did a very kind thing. She took off her scarf and gave it to him. "In case you should feel cold," she whispered. Her face was aglow, but Tony's was very gloomy. As they turned on the top of the hump, he whispered to her, "I'm afraid nurse would see me, so I shan't be able to do it." Mamie admired him more than ever for being afraid of nothing but their ayah, when there were so many unknown terrors to fear, and she said aloud, "Tony, I shall race you to the gate," and in a whisper, "Then you can hide," and off they ran. Tony could always outdistance her easily, but never had she known him speed away so quickly as now, and she was sure he hurried that he might have more time to hide. Brave, brave, her doting eyes were crying, when she got a dreadful shock. Instead of hiding, her hero had run out at the gate. At this bitter sight Mamie stopped blankly, as if all her lapful of darling treasures was suddenly spilled, and then for very disdain she could not sob. In a swell of protest against all puling cowards, she ran to St. Govor's well and hid in Tony's stead. When the ayah reached the gate and saw Tony far in front, she thought her other charge was with him and passed out. Twilight came on, and scores and hundreds of people passed out, including the last one, who always has to run for it, but Mamie saw them not. She had shut her eyes tight and glued them with passionate tears. When she opened them, something very cold ran up her legs and up her arms and dropped into her heart. It was the stillness of the gardens. Then she heard clang, then from another part clang, then clang, clang far away. It was the closing of the gates. Immediately the last clang had died away, Mamie distinctly heard a voice say, "So that's all right." It had a wooden sound and seemed to come from above, and she looked up in time to see an elm tree stretching out its arms and yawning. She was about to say, "I never knew you could speak," when a metallic voice that seemed to come from the ladle at the well remarked to the elm, "I suppose it is a bit coldish up there," and the elm replied, "Not particularly, but you do get numb standing so long on one leg," and he flapped his arms vigorously, just as the cabmen do before they drive off. Mamie was quite surprised to see that a number of other tall trees were doing the same sort of thing, and she stole away to the baby walk, and crouched observantly under a Minorca holly, which shrugged its shoulders but did not seem to mind her. She was not in the least cold. She was wearing a russet-coloured pelisse, and had the hood over her head, so that nothing of her showed except her dear little face and her curls. The rest of her real self was hidden far away, inside so many warm garments, that in shape she seemed rather like a ball. She was about 40 round the waist. There was a good deal going on in the baby walk when Mamie arrived in time to see a magnolia and a Persian lilac step over the railing and set off for a smart walk. They moved in a jerky sort of way, certainly, but that was because they used crutches. An elderberry hobbled across the walk and stood chatting with some young quinces, and they all had crutches. The crutches were the sticks that are tied to young trees and shrubs. They were quite familiar objects to Maimie, but she had never known what they were there for until to-night. She peeped up the walk and saw her first fairy. He was a street boy fairy who was running up the walk, closing the weeping trees. The way he did it was this. He pressed a spring in the trunk, and they shut like umbrellas, deluging the little plants beneath with snow. "Oh, you naughty, naughty child!" Maimie cried indignantly, for she knew what it was to have a dripping umbrella about your ears. Fortunately the mischievous fellow was out of earshot, but the chrysanthemums heard her, and they all said so pointedly, "Hoity-toity, what is this?" that she had to come out and show herself. Then the whole vegetable kingdom was rather puzzled what to do. "Of course it is no affair of ours," a spindle-tree said, after they had whispered together, "but you know quite well you ought not to be here, and perhaps our duty is to report you to the fairies. What do you think yourself?" "I think you should not," Maimie replied, which so perplexed them that they said petulantly there was no arguing with her. "I wouldn't ask it of you," she assured them, "if I thought it was wrong." And of course after this they could not well carry tales. Then they said, "Well-a-day," and "Such is life," for they can be frightfully sarcastic. But she felt sorry for those of them who had no crutches, and she said good-naturedly, "Before I go to the fairies' ball, I should like to take you for a walk, one at a time. You can lean on me, you know." At this they clapped their hands, and she escorted them up the baby walk and back again, one at a time, putting an arm or a finger round the very frail, setting their leg right when it got too ridiculous, and treating the foreign ones quite as courteously as the English, though she could not understand a word they said. They behaved well on the whole, though some whimpered that she had not taken them as far as she took Nancy or Grace or Dorothy, and others jagged her, but it was quite unintentional, and she was too much of a lady to cry out. So much walking tired her, and she was anxious to be off to the ball, but she no longer felt afraid. The reason she felt no more fear was that it was now night-time, and in the dark, you remember, Maimie was always rather strange. They were now loath to let her go, for "If the fairies see you," they warned her, "they will mischief you, stab you to death, or compel you to nurse their children, or turn you into something tedious like an evergreen oak." As they said this they looked with affected pity at an evergreen oak, for in winter they are very envious of the evergreens. "Oh, la!" replied the oak bitingly, "how deliciously cosy it is to stand here, buttoned to the neck, and watch you poor naked creatures shivering." This made them sulky, though they had really brought it on themselves, and they drew from Maimie a very gloomy picture of the perils that faced her if she insisted on going to the ball. She learned from a purple filbert that the court was not in its usual good temper at present, the cause being the tantalizing heart of the Duke of Christmas Daisies. He was an Oriental fairy, very poorly of a dreadful complaint, namely, inability to love, and though he had tried many ladies in many lands, he could not fall in love with one of them. Queen Mab, who rules in the gardens, had been confident that her girls would bewitch him, but alas, his heart, the doctor said, remained cold. This rather irritating doctor, who was his private physician, felt the Duke's heart immediately after any lady was presented, and then always shook his bald head and murmured, "Cold, quite cold." Naturally Queen Mab felt disgraced, and first she tried the effect of ordering the court into tears for 9 minutes, and then she blamed the Cupids and decreed that they should wear fools' caps until they thawed the Duke's frozen heart. "How I should love to see the Cupids in their dear little fools' caps!" Maimie cried, and away she ran to look for them very recklessly, for the Cupids hate to be laughed at. It is always easy to discover where a fairy's ball is being held,
as ribbons are stretched between it and all the populous parts of the gardens, on which those invited may walk to the dance without wetting their pumps. This night the ribbons were red, and looked very pretty on the snow. Maimie walked alongside one of them for some distance without meeting anybody, but at last she saw a fairy cavalcade approaching. To her surprise they seemed to be returning from the ball, and she had just time to hide from them by bending her knees and holding out her arms and pretending to be a garden chair. There were 6 horsemen in front and 6 behind. In the middle walked a prim lady wearing a long train held up by 2 pages, and on the train, as if it were a couch, reclined a lovely girl, for in this way do aristocratic fairies travel about. She was dressed in golden rain, but the most enviable part of her was her neck, which was blue in colour and of a velvet texture, and of course showed off her diamond necklace, as no white throat could have glorified it. The high-born fairies obtained this admired effect by pricking their skin, which lets the blue blood come through and dye them, and you cannot imagine anything so dazzling unless you have seen the ladies' busts in the jewellers' windows. Maimie also noticed that the whole cavalcade seemed to be in a passion, tilting their noses higher than it can be safe for even fairies to tilt them, and she concluded that this must be another case in which the doctor had said, "Cold, quite cold." Well, she followed the ribbon to a place where it became a bridge over a dry puddle, into which another fairy had fallen and been unable to climb out. At first this little damsel was afraid of Maimie, who most kindly went to her aid, but soon she sat in her hand chatting gaily, and explaining that her name was Brownie, and that though only a poor street singer, she was on her way to the ball to see if the Duke would have her. "Of course," she said, "I am rather plain," and this made Maimie uncomfortable, for indeed the simple little creature was almost quite plain for a fairy. It was difficult to know what to reply. "I see you think I have no chance," Brownie said falteringly. "I don't say that," Maimie answered politely. "Of course your face is just a tiny bit homely, but—" Really, it was quite awkward for her. Fortunately she remembered about her father and the bazaar. He had gone to a fashionable bazaar, where all the most beautiful ladies in London were on view for half-a-crown the second day, but on his return home, instead of being dissatisfied with Maimie's mother, he had said, "You can't think, my dear, what a relief it is to see a homely face again." Maimie repeated this story, and it fortified Brownie tremendously. Indeed, she had no longer the slightest doubt that the Duke would choose her. So she scudded away up the ribbon, calling out to Maimie not to follow, lest the Queen should mischief her. But Maimie's curiosity tugged her forward, and presently at the 7 Spanish chestnuts she saw a wonderful light. She crept forward until she was quite near it, and then she peeped from behind a tree. The light, which was as high as your head above the ground, was composed of myriads of glow-worms, all holding on to each other, and so forming a dazzling canopy over the fairy ring. There were thousands of little people looking on, but they were in shadow and drab in colour compared to the glorious creatures within that luminous circle, who were so bewilderingly bright that Maimie had to wink hard all the time she looked at them. It was amazing and even irritating to her that the Duke of Christmas Daisies should be able to keep out of love for a moment, yet out of love his dusky grace still was. You could see it by the shamed looks of the Queen and court, though they pretended not to care, by the way darling ladies brought forward for his approval burst into tears as they were told to pass on, and by his own most dreary face. Mamie could also see the pompous doctor feeling the Duke's heart, and hear him give utterance to his parrot cry, and she was particularly sorry for the Cupids, who stood in their fools' caps in obscure places, and every time they heard that cold, quite cold, bowed their disgraced little heads. She was disappointed not to see Peter Pan, and I may as well tell you now why he was so late that night. It was because his boat had got wedged on the Serpentine between fields of floating ice, through which he had to break a perilous passage with his trusty paddle. The fairies had as yet scarcely missed him, for they could not dance, so heavy were their hearts. They forget all the steps when they are sad, and remember them again when they are merry. David tells me that fairies never say, "We feel happy." What they say is, "We feel dancey." Well, they were looking very undancey indeed when sudden laughter broke out among the onlookers, caused by Brownie, who had just arrived and was insisting on her right to be presented to the Duke. Mamie craned forward eagerly to see how her friend fared, though she had really no hope. No one seemed to have the least hope except Brownie herself, who, however, was absolutely confident. She was led before his Grace, and the doctor, putting a finger carelessly on the ducal heart, which for convenience sake was reached by a little trapdoor in his diamond shirt, had begun to say mechanically, "Cold, quite," when he stopped abruptly. "What's this?" he cried, and first he shook the heart like a watch, and then put his ear to it. "Bless my soul!" cried the doctor, and by this time, of course, the excitement among the spectators was tremendous. Fairies fainting right and left. Everybody stared breathlessly at the Duke, who was very much startled and looked as if he would like to run away. "Good gracious me!" the doctor was heard muttering, and now the heart was evidently on fire, for he had to jerk his fingers away from it and put them in his mouth. The suspense was awful. Then, in a loud voice and bowing low, "My Lord Duke," said the physician elatedly, "I have the honour to inform your Excellency that your Grace is in love." You can't conceive the effect of it. Brownie held out her arms to the Duke, and he flung himself into them. The Queen leapt into the arms of the Lord Chamberlain, and the ladies of the court leapt into the arms of her gentlemen, for it is quite etiquette to follow her example in everything. Thus, in a single moment, about 50 marriages took place, for if you leap into each other's arms, it is a fairy wedding. Of course, a clergyman has to be present. How the crowd cheered and leapt! Trumpets brayed, the moon came out, and immediately 1,000 couples seized hold of its rays, as if they were ribbons in a May dance, and waltzed in wild abandon around the fairy ring. Most gladsome sight of all, the Cupids plucked the hated fools' caps from their heads and cast them high in the air. And then Mamie went and spoiled everything. She couldn't help it. She was crazy with delight over her little friend's good fortune. So she took several steps forward and cried in an ecstasy, "Oh, Brownie, how splendid!" Everybody stood still. The music ceased, the lights went out, and all in the time you may take to say, "Oh dear." An awful sense of her peril came upon Mamie. Too late she remembered that she was a lost child, in a place where no human must be between the locking and the opening of the gates. She heard the murmur of an angry multitude. She saw 1,000 swords flashing for her blood, and she uttered a cry of terror and fled. How she ran, and all the time her eyes were starting out of her head. Many times she lay down, and then quickly jumped up and ran on again. Her little mind was so entangled in terrors that she no longer knew she was in the gardens. The one thing she was sure of was that she must never cease to run, and she thought she was still running long after she had dropped in the figs and gone to sleep. She thought the snowflakes falling on her face were her mother kissing her good night. She thought her coverlet of snow was a warm blanket, and tried to pull it over her head. And when she heard talking through her dreams, she thought it was her mother bringing father to the nursery door to look at her as she slept. But it was the fairies. I am very glad to be able to say that they no longer desired to mischief her. When she rushed away, they had rent the air with such cries as "Slay her!" "Turn her into something extremely unpleasant," and so on. But the pursuit was delayed while they discussed who should march in front, and this gave Duchess Brownie time to cast herself before the Queen and demand a boon. Every bride has a right to a boon, and what she asked for was Mamie's life. "Anything except that," replied Queen Mab sternly, and all the fairies chanted, "Anything except that." But when they learned how Mamie had befriended Brownie, and so enabled her to attend the ball to their great glory and renown, they gave 3 huzzas for the little human, and set off like an army to thank her, the court advancing in front, and the canopy keeping step with it. They traced Mamie easily by her footprints in the snow. But though they found her deep in snow in the figs, it seemed impossible to thank Mamie, for they could not waken her. They went through the form of thanking her, that is to say, the new king stood on her body and read her a long address of welcome, but she heard not a word of it. They also cleared the snow off her, but soon she was covered again, and they saw she was in danger of perishing of cold. "Turn her into something that does not mind the cold," seemed a good suggestion of the doctors, but the only thing they could think of that does not mind cold was a snowflake. And it might melt, the Queen pointed out, so that idea had to be given up. A magnificent attempt was made to carry her to a sheltered spot, but though there were so many of them, she was too heavy. By this time all the ladies were crying in their handkerchiefs, but presently the Cupids had a lovely idea. "Build a house round her," they cried, and at once everybody perceived that this was the thing to do. In a moment 100 fairy sawyers were among the branches. Architects were running round Mamie measuring her. A bricklayer's yard sprang up at her feet. 75 masons rushed up with the foundation stone, and the Queen laid it. Overseers were appointed to keep the boys off. Scaffoldings were run up. The whole place rang with hammers and chisels and turning lathes, and by this time the roof was on, and the glaziers were putting in the windows. The house was exactly the size of Mamie, and perfectly lovely. One of her arms was extended, and this had bothered them for a second, but they built a veranda round it, leading to the front door. The windows were the size of a coloured picture book, and the door rather smaller, but it would be easy for her to get out by taking off the roof. The fairies, as is their custom, clapped their hands with delight over their cleverness, and they were all so madly in love with the little house that they could not bear to think they had finished it, so they gave it ever so many little extra touches, and even then they added more extra touches. For instance, 2 of them ran up a ladder and put on a chimney. "Now we fear it is quite finished," they sighed, but no, for another 2 ran up the ladder and tied some smoke to the chimney. "That certainly finishes it," they cried reluctantly. "Not at all," cried a glowworm. "If she were to wake without seeing a night light, she might be frightened, so I shall be her night light." "Wait 1 moment," said a china merchant, "and I shall make you a saucer." Now, alas, it was absolutely finished. "Oh dear, no!" "Gracious me!" cried a brass manufacturer, "there's no handle on the door," and he put one on. An ironmonger added a scraper, and an old lady ran up with a doormat. Carpenters arrived with a water butt, and the painters insisted on painting it. Finished at last. Finished? How can it be finished, the plumber demanded scornfully, before hot and cold are put in? And he put in hot and cold. Then an army of gardeners arrived with fairy carts, and spades and seeds and bulbs and forcing houses, and soon they had a flower garden to the right of the veranda, and a vegetable garden to the left, and roses and clematis on the walls of the house, and in less time than 5 minutes all these dear things were in full bloom. Oh, how beautiful the little house was now! But it was at last finished, true as true, and they had to leave it and return to the dance. They all kissed their hands to it as they went away, and the last to go was Brownie. She stayed a moment behind the others to drop a pleasant dream down the chimney. All through the night the exquisite little house stood there in the figs, taking care of Mamie, and she never knew. She slept until the dream was quite finished, and woke feeling deliciously cosy, just as morning was breaking from its egg, and then she almost fell asleep again, and then she called out, "Tony!" for she thought she was at home in the nursery. As Tony made no answer, she sat up, whereupon her head hit the roof, and it opened like the lid of a box, and to her bewilderment she saw all around her the Kensington Gardens lying deep in snow. As she was not in the nursery, she wondered whether this was really herself, so she pinched her cheeks, and then she knew it was herself, and this reminded her that she was in the middle of a great adventure. She remembered now everything that had happened to her, from the closing of the gates up to her running away from the fairies. But however, she asked herself, had she got into this funny place? She stepped out by the roof, right over the garden, and then she saw the dear house in which she had passed the night. It so entranced her that she could think of nothing else. "Oh, you darling! Oh, you sweet! Oh, you love!" she cried. Perhaps a human voice frightened the little house, or maybe it now knew that its work was done, for no sooner had Mamie spoken than it began to grow smaller. It shrank so slowly that she could scarce believe it was shrinking, yet she soon knew that it could not contain her now. It always remained as complete as ever, but it became smaller and smaller, and the garden dwindled at the same time, and the snow crept closer, lapping house and garden up. Now the house was the size of a little dog's kennel, and now of a Noah's ark, but still you could see the smoke and the door handle and the roses on the wall, every one complete. The glow-worm light was waning too, but it was still there. "Darling, loveliest, don't go," Mamie cried, falling on her knees, for the little house was now the size of a reel of thread, but still quite complete. But as she stretched out her arms imploringly, the snow crept up on all sides until it met itself, and where the little house had been was now one unbroken expanse of snow. Mamie stamped her foot naughtily, and was putting her fingers to her eyes, when she heard a kind voice say, "Don't cry, pretty human, don't cry," and then she turned round, and saw a beautiful little naked boy regarding her wistfully. She knew at once that he must be Peter Pan. End of chapter 17.
Chapter 18 of The Little White Bird. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rosehip. The Little White Bird, Chapter 18. Peter's Goat. Mamie felt quite shy, but Peter knew not what shy was. "I hope you have had a good night," he said earnestly. "Thank you," she replied. "I was so cosy and warm. But you," and she looked at his nakedness awkwardly, "don't you feel the least bit cold?" Now cold was another word Peter had forgotten, so he answered, "I think not, but I may be wrong. You see, I am rather ignorant. I am not exactly a boy. Solomon says I am a betwixt and between." "So that is what it is called," said Mamie thoughtfully. "That's not my name," he explained. "My name is Peter Pan." "Yes, of course," she said. "I know. Everybody knows." You can't think how pleased Peter was to learn that all the people outside the gates knew about him. He begged Mamie to tell him what they knew and what they said, and she did so. They were sitting by this time on a fallen tree. Peter had cleared off the snow for Mamie, but he sat on a snowy bit himself. "Squeeze closer," Mamie said. "What is that?" he asked, and she showed him, and then he did it. They talked together, and he found that people knew a great deal about him, but not everything. Not that he had gone back to his mother and been barred out, for instance, and he said nothing of this to Mamie, for it still humiliated him. "Do they know that I play games exactly like real boys?" he asked very proudly. "Oh, Mamie, please tell them." But when he revealed how he played, by sailing his hoop on the round pond, and so on, she was simply horrified. "All your ways of playing," she said, with her big eyes on him, "are quite, quite wrong, and not in the least like how boys play." Poor Peter uttered a little moan at this, and he cried for the first time for I know not how long. Mamie was extremely sorry for him, and lent him her handkerchief, but he didn't know in the least what to do with it, so she showed him. That is to say, she wiped her eyes and then gave it back to him, saying, "Now you do it." But instead of wiping his own eyes, he wiped hers, and she thought it best to pretend that this was what she had meant. She said, out of pity for him, "I shall give you a kiss if you like." But though he once knew, he had long forgotten what kisses are, and he replied, "Thank you," and held out his hand, thinking she had offered to put something into it. This was a great shock to her, but she felt she could not explain without shaming him, so with charming delicacy she gave Peter a thimble which happened to be in her pocket, and pretended that it was a kiss. Poor little boy, he quite believed her, and to this day he wears it on his finger, though there can be scarcely anyone who needs a thimble so little. You see, though still a tiny child, it was really years and years since he had seen his mother, and I dare say the baby who had supplanted him was now a man with whiskers. But you must not think that Peter Pan was a boy to pity rather than to admire. If Mamie began by thinking this, she soon found she was very much mistaken. Her eyes glistened with admiration when he told her of his adventures, especially of how he went to and fro between the island and the gardens in the thrush's nest. "How romantic!" Mamie exclaimed, but it was another unknown word, and he hung his head, thinking she was despising him. "I suppose Tony would not have done that," he said very humbly. "Never, never," she answered with conviction. "He would have been afraid." "What is afraid?" asked Peter longingly. He thought it must be some splendid thing. "I do wish you would teach me how to be afraid, Mamie," he said. "I believe no one could teach that to you," she answered adoringly, but Peter thought she meant that he was stupid. She had told him about Tony, and of the wicked thing she did in the dark to frighten him. She knew quite well that it was wicked, but Peter misunderstood her meaning and said, "Oh, how I wish I was as brave as Tony." It quite irritated her. "You are 20,000 times braver than Tony," she said. "You are ever so much the bravest boy I ever knew." He could scarcely believe she meant it, but when he did believe, he screamed with joy. "And if you want very much to give me a kiss," Mamie said, "you can do it." Very reluctantly Peter began to take the thimble off his finger. He thought she wanted it back. "I don't mean a kiss," she said hurriedly. "I mean a thimble." "What's that?" Peter asked. "It's like this," she said, and kissed him. "I should love to give you a thimble," Peter said gravely, so he gave her one. He gave her quite a number of thimbles, and then a delightful idea came into his head. "Mamie," he said, "will you marry me?" Now, strange to tell, the same idea had come at exactly the same time into Mamie's head. "I should like to," she answered, "but will there be room in your boat for two?" "If you squeeze close," he said eagerly. "Perhaps the birds would be angry." He assured her that the birds would love to have her, though I am not so certain of it myself, also that there were very few birds in winter. "Of course they might want your clothes," he had to admit rather falteringly. She was somewhat indignant at this. "They are always thinking of their nests," he said apologetically, "and there are some bits of you," he stroked the fur on her pelisse, "that would excite them very much." "They shan't have my fur," she said sharply. "No," he said, still fondling it, however. "No. Oh, Mamie," he said rapturously, "do you know why I love you? It is because you are like a beautiful nest." Somehow this made her uneasy. "I think you are speaking more like a bird than a boy now," she said, holding back, and indeed he was even looking rather like a bird. "After all," she said, "you are only a betwixt and between." But it hurt him so much that she immediately added, "It must be a delicious thing to be." "Come and be one then, dear Mamie," he implored her, and they set off for the boat, for it was now very near open gate time. "And you are not a bit like a nest," he whispered to please her. "But I think it is rather nice to be like one," she said in a woman's contradictory way. "And Peter, dear, though I can't give them my fur, I wouldn't mind their building in it. Fancy a nest in my neck with little spotty eggs in it. Oh, Peter, how perfectly lovely!" But as they drew near the Serpentine, she shivered a little and said, "Of course I shall go and see mother often, quite often. It's not as if I was saying good-bye for ever to mother. It is not in the least like that." "Oh no," answered Peter, but in his heart he knew it was very like that, and he would have told her so had he not been in a quaking fear of losing her. He was so fond of her, he felt he could not live without her. "She will forget her mother in time and be happy with me," he kept saying to himself, and he hurried her on, giving her thimbles by the way. But even when she had seen the boat and exclaimed ecstatically over its loveliness, she still talked tremblingly about her mother. "You know quite well, Peter, don't you," she said, "that I wouldn't come unless I knew for certain I could go back to mother whenever I want to? Peter, say it." He said it, but he could no longer look her in the face. If you are sure your mother will always want you," he added rather sourly. "The idea of mother's not always wanting me!" Mamie cried, and her face glistened. "If she doesn't bar you out," said Peter huskily. "The door," replied Mamie, "will always, always be open, and mother will always be waiting at it for me." "Then," said Peter, not without grimness, "step in if you feel so sure of her," and he helped Mamie into the thrush's nest. "But why don't you look at me?" she asked, taking him by the arm. Peter tried hard not to look. He tried to push off, then he gave a great gulp and jumped ashore and sat down miserably in the snow. She went to him. "What is it, dear, dear Peter?" she said, wondering. "Oh, Mamie," he cried, "it isn't fair to take you with me if you think you can go back. Your mother," he gulped again, "you don't know them as well as I do." And then he told her the woeful story of how he had been barred out, and she gasped all the time. "But my mother," she said, "my mother." "Yes, she would," said Peter. "They are all the same. I dare say she is looking for another one already." Mamie said aghast, "I can't believe it. You see, when you went away your mother had none, but my mother has Tony, and surely they are satisfied when they have one." Peter replied bitterly, "You should see the letters Solomon gets from ladies who have 6. Just then they heard a grating creak, followed by creak, creak all round the gardens. It was the opening of the gates, and Peter jumped nervously into his boat. He knew Mamie would not come with him now, and he was trying bravely not to cry. But Mamie was sobbing painfully. "If I should be too late," she called in agony. "Oh, Peter, if she has got another one already!" Again he sprang ashore, as if she had called him back. "I shall come and look for you to-night," he said, squeezing close, "but if you hurry away, I think you will be in time." Again he sprang ashore, as if she had called him back. "I shall come and look for you to-night," he said, squeezing close, "but if you hurry away, I think you will be in time." Then he pressed a last thimble on her sweet little mouth, and covered his face with his hands, so that he might not see her go. "Dear Peter," she cried. "Dear Mamie," cried the tragic boy. She leapt into his arms, so that it was a sort of fairy wedding, and then she hurried away. Oh, how she hastened to the gates! Peter, you may be sure, was back in the gardens that night as soon as Lock-out sounded, but he found no Mamie, and so he knew she had been in time. For long he hoped that some night she would come back to him. Often he thought he saw her waiting for him by the shore of the Serpentine as his bark drew to land. But Mamie never went back. She wanted to, but she was afraid that if she saw her dear Betwixt and Between again she would linger with him too long, and besides the ayah now kept a sharp eye on her. But she often talked lovingly of Peter, and she knitted a kettle-holder for him, and one day, when she was wondering what Easter present he would like, her mother made a suggestion. Nothing, she said thoughtfully, would be so useful to him as a goat. "He could ride on it," cried Mamie, "and play on his pipe at the same time." "Then," her mother asked, "won't you give him your goat, the one you frighten Tony with at night?" "But it isn't a real goat," Mamie said. "It seems very real to Tony," replied her mother. "It seems frightfully real to me too," Mamie admitted, "but how could I give it to Peter?" Her mother knew a way, and next day, accompanied by Tony, who was really quite a nice boy, though of course he could not compare, they went to the gardens, and Maimie stood alone within a fairy ring, and then her mother, who was a rather gifted lady, said, "My daughter, tell me, if you can, what have you got for Peter Pan?" To which Maimie replied, "I have a goat for him to ride, observe me cast it far and wide." She then flung her arms about as if she were sowing seed, and turned round 3 times. Next Tony said, "If P doth find it waiting here, wilt ne'er again make me to fear?" And Maimie answered, "By dark or light I fondly swear never to see goats anywhere." She also left a letter to Peter in a likely place, explaining what she had done, and begging him to ask the fairies to turn the goat into one convenient for riding on. Well, it all happened just as she hoped, for Peter found the letter, and of course nothing could be easier for the fairies than to turn the goat into a real one, and so that is how Peter got the goat, on which he now rides round the gardens every night, playing sublimely on his pipe. And Maimie kept her promise, and never frightened Tony with a goat again, though I have heard that she created another animal. Until she was quite a big girl, she continued to leave presents for Peter in the gardens, with letters explaining how humans play with them, and she is not the only one who has done this. David does it, for instance, and he and I know the likeliest place for leaving them in, and we shall tell you if you like, but for mercy's sake don't ask us before Porthos, for were he to find out the place he would take every one of them. Though Peter still remembers Maimie, he is becoming as gay as ever, and often in sheer happiness he jumps off his goat and lies kicking merrily on the grass. Oh, he has a joyful time, but he has still a vague memory that he was a human once, and it makes him especially kind to the house swallows when they revisit the island, for house swallows are the spirits of little children who have died. They always build in the eaves of the houses where they lived when they were humans, and sometimes they try to fly in at a nursery window, and perhaps that is why Peter loves them best of all the birds. And the little house, every lawful night, that is to say every night except ball nights, the fairies now build the little house lest there should be a human child lost in the gardens, and Peter rides the marshes looking for lost ones, and if he finds them he carries them on his goat to the little house, and when they wake up they are in it, and when they step out they see it. The fairies build the house merely because it is so pretty, but Peter rides round in memory of Maimie, and because he still loves to do just as he believes real boys would do. But you must not think that, because somewhere among the trees the little house is twinkling, it is a safe thing to remain in the gardens after lock-out time. If the bad ones among the fairies happen to be out that night, they will certainly mischief you, and even though they are not, you may perish of cold and dark before Peter Pan comes round. He has been too late several times, and when he sees he is too late, he runs back to the thrush's nest for his paddle, of which Maimie had told him the true use, and he digs a grave for the child, and erects a little tombstone, and carves the poor thing's initials on it. He does this at once, because he thinks it is what real boys would do, and you must have noticed the little stones, and that there are always 2 together. He puts them in 2s because it seems less lonely. I think that quite the most touching sight in the gardens is the 2 tombstones of Walter Stephen Matthews and Phoebe Phelps, They stand together at the spot where the parishes of Westminster St. Mary's is said to meet the parish of Paddington. Here Peter found the two babes, who had fallen unnoticed from their perambulators, Phoebe aged 13 months, and Walter probably still younger, for Peter seems to have felt a delicacy about putting any age on his stone. They lie side by side, and the simple inscriptions read: W. St. M. 13A. P.P. 1841. David sometimes places white flowers on these two innocent graves. But how strange for parents, when they hurry into the gardens at the opening of the gates, looking for their lost one, to find the sweetest little tombstone instead. I do hope that Peter is not too ready with his spade. It is all rather sad. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Little White Bird. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rosehip. The Little White Bird by J. M. Barrie. Chapter 19. An Interloper. David and I had a tremendous adventure. It was this: he passed the night with me. We had often talked of it as a possible thing, and at last Mary consented to our having it. The adventure began with David's coming to me at the unwonted hour of 6 p.m., carrying what looked like a packet of sandwiches, but proved to be his requisites for the night, done up in a neat paper parcel. We were both so excited that, at the moment of greeting, neither of us could be apposite to the occasion in words, so we communicated our feelings by signs, as thus: David half sat down in a place where there was no chair, which is his favourite preparation for being emphatic, and is borrowed, I think, from the frogs, and we then made the extraordinary faces which mean, "What a tremendous adventure!" We were to do all the important things precisely as they are done every evening at his own home, and so I am in a puzzle to know how it was such an adventure to David. But I have now said enough to show you what an adventure it was to me. For a little while we played with my two medals, and, with the delicacy of a sleeping companion, David abstained on this occasion from asking why one of them was not a Victoria Cross. He is very troubled because I never won the Victoria Cross, for it lowers his status in the Gardens. He never says in the Gardens that I won it, but he fights any boy of his year who says I didn't. Their fighting consists of challenging each other. At 6:25 I turned on the hot water in the bath, and covertly swallowed a small glass of brandy. I then said, 6:30, time for little boys to be in bed. I said it in the matter-of-fact voice of one made free of the company of parents, as if I had said it often before, and would have to say it often again, and as if there was nothing particularly delicious to me in hearing myself say it. I tried to say it in that way. And David was deceived. To my exceeding joy he stamped his little foot, and was so naughty that, in gratitude, I gave him 5 minutes with a matchbox. Matches, which he drops on the floor when lighted, are the greatest treat you can give David. Indeed, I think his private heaven is a place with a roaring bonfire. Then I placed my hand carelessly on his shoulder, like one a trifle bored by the dull routine of putting my little boys to bed, and conducted him to the night nursery, which had lately been my private chamber. There was an extra bed in it to-night, very near my own, but differently shaped, and scarcely less conspicuous was the new mantel-shelf ornament, a tumbler of milk with a biscuit on top of it, and a chocolate riding on the biscuit. To enter the room without seeing the tumbler at once was impossible. I had tried it several times, and David saw and promptly did his frog business the while. With an indescribable emotion I produced a night-light from my pocket and planted it in a saucer on the washstand. David watched my preparations with distasteful levity, but anon made a noble amend by abruptly offering me his foot as if he had no longer use for it, and I knew by intuition that he expected me to take off his boots. I took them off with all the coolness of an old hand, and then I placed him on my knee and removed his blouse. This was a delightful experience, but I think I remained wonderfully calm until I came somewhat too suddenly to his little braces, which agitated me profoundly. I cannot proceed in public with the disrobing of David. Soon the night-nursery was in darkness, but for the glimmer from the night-light, and very still save when the door creaked as a man peered in at the little figure on the bed. However softly I opened the door, an inch at a time, his bright eyes turned to me at once, and he always made the face which means, "What a tremendous adventure!" "Are you never to fall asleep, David?" I always said. "When are you coming to bed?" he always replied, very brave, but in a whisper, as if he feared the bears and wolves might have him. When little boys are in bed, there is nothing between them and bears and wolves but the night-light. I returned to my chair to think, and at last he fell asleep with his face to the wall, but even then I stood many times at the door listening. Long after I had gone to bed, a sudden silence filled the chamber, and I knew that David had awaked. I lay motionless, and after what seemed a long time of waiting, a little far-away voice said in a cautious whisper, "Irene." "You were sleeping with me to-night, you know, David," I said. "I didn't know," he replied, a little troubled, but trying not to be a nuisance. "You remember you were with me?" I asked. After a moment's hesitation he replied, "I nearly remember," and presently he added very gratefully, as if to some angel who had whispered to him, "I remember now." I think he had nigh fallen asleep again when he stirred and said, "Is it going on now?" "What?" "The adventure." "Yes, David." Perhaps this disturbed him, for by and by I had to inquire, "You are not frightened, are you?" "Am I not?" he answered politely, and I knew his hand was groping in the darkness, so I put out mine, and he held on tightly to one finger. "I am not frightened now," he whispered. "And there is nothing else you want?" "Is there not?" he again asked politely. "Are you sure there's not?" he added. "What can it be, David?" "I don't take up very much room," the far-away voice said. "Why, David," said I, sitting up, "do you want to come into my bed?" "Mother said I wasn't to want it unless you wanted it first," he squeaked. "It is what I've been wanting all the time," said I, and then without more ado the little white figure rose and flung itself at me. For the rest of the night he lay on me and across me, and sometimes his feet were at the bottom of the bed, and sometimes on the pillow, but he always retained possession of my finger, and occasionally he woke me to say that he was sleeping with me. I had not a good night. I lay thinking of this little boy who, in the midst of his play while I undressed him, had suddenly buried his head on my knees, of the woman who had been for him who could be sufficiently daring, of David's dripping little form in the bath, and how when I essayed to catch him he had slipped from my arms like a trout, of how I had stood by the open door listening to his sweet breathing, had stood so long that I forgot his name and called him Timothy. End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of The Little White Bird. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sandra. The Little White Bird by J. M. Barrie. Chapter 20. David and Porthos compared. But Mary spoilt it all when I sent David back to her in the morning, by inquiring too curiously into his person, and discovering that I had put his combinations on him with the buttons to the front. For this I wrote her the following insulting letter. When Mary does anything that specially annoys me, I send her an insulting letter. I once had a photograph taken of David being hanged on a tree. I sent her that. You can't think of all the subtle ways of grieving her I have. No woman with the spirit of a crow would stand it. Dear Madam, I wrote, it has come to my knowledge that when you walk in the gardens with the boy David, you listen avidly for encomiums of him, and of your fanciful dressing of him by passers-by. Storing them in your heart the while, you make vain pretence to regard them not. Wherefore, lest you be swollen by these very small things, I, who now know David both day and by night, am minded to compare him and Porthos, the one with the other, both in this matter and in other matters of graver account. And touching this matter of outward show, they are both very lordly, and neither of them likes it to be referred to, but they endure it in different ways. For David says, "Oh, bother," and even at times hits out, but Porthos droops his tail and lets them have their say. Yet is he extolled as beautiful and a darling 10 times for the once that David is extolled? The manners of Porthos are therefore prettier than the manners of David, who, when he has sent me to hide from him behind a tree, sometimes comes not in search, and on emerging tamely from my concealment, I find him playing other games entirely forgetful of my existence, whereas Porthos always comes in search. Also, if David wearies of you, he scruples not to say so, but Porthos, in like circumstances, offers you his paw, meaning farewell, and to bearded men he does this all the time, I think because of a hereditary distaste for goats, so that they conceive him to be enamoured of them, when he is only begging them courteously to go. Thus, while the manners of Porthos are more polite, it may be argued that those of David are more efficacious. In gentleness, David compares ill with Porthos, for whereas the one shoves and has been known to kick on slight provocation, the other, who is noisily hated of all small dogs by reason of his size, remonstrates not, even when they cling in froth and fury to his chest, but carries them along tolerantly until they drop off from fatigue. Again, David will not unbend when in the company of babies, expecting them unreasonably to rise to his level, but contrariwise, Porthos, though terrible to tramps, suffers all things of babies, even to an exploration of his mouth, in an attempt to discover what his tongue is like at the other end. The comings and goings of David are unnoticed by perambulators, which lie in wait for the advent of Porthos. The strong and wicked fear Porthos, but no little creature fears him, not the hedgehogs he conveys from place to place in his mouth, nor the sparrows that steal his straw from under him. In proof of which gentleness I adduce his adventure with the rabbit. Having gone for a time to reside in a rabbit country, Porthos was elated to discover at last something small that ran from him, and developing at once into an ecstatic sportsman, he did pound hotly in pursuit, though always overshooting the mark by 100 yards or so, and wondering very much what had become of the rabbit. There was a steep path from the top of which the rabbit suddenly came into view, and the practice of Porthos was to advance up it on tiptoe, turning near the summit to give me a knowing look, and then bounding forward. The rabbit here did something tricky with a hole in the ground, but Porthos tore onwards in full faith that the game was being played fairly, and always returned panting and puzzling, but glorious. I sometimes shuddered to think of his perplexity should he catch the rabbit, which, however, was extremely unlikely. Nevertheless, he did catch it. I know not how, but presume it to have been another than the one of which he was in chase. I found him with it, his brows furrowed in the deepest thought, the rabbit, terrified but uninjured, cowered beneath him. Porthos gave me a happy look, and again dropped into a weighty frame of mind. What is the next thing one does was obviously the puzzle with him, and the position was scarcely less awkward for the rabbit, which several times made a move to end this intolerable suspense. Whereupon Porthos immediately gave it a warning tap with his foot, and again fell to pondering. The strain on me was very great. At last they seemed to hit upon a compromise. Porthos looked over his shoulder very self-consciously, and the rabbit, at first slowly, and then in a flash, withdrew. Porthos pretended to make a search for it, but you cannot think how relieved he looked. He even tried to brazen out his disgrace before me, and waved his tail appealingly. But he could not look me in the face, and when he saw that this was what I insisted on, he collapsed at my feet and moaned. There were real tears in his eyes, and I was touched, and swore to him that he had done everything a dog could do, and though he knew I was lying, he became happy again. For so long as I am pleased with him, ma'am, nothing else greatly matters to Porthos. I told this story to David, having first extracted a promise from him that he would not think the less of Porthos, and now I must demand the same promise of you. Also, an admission that in innocence of heart, for which David has been properly commended, he can nevertheless teach Porthos nothing, but on the contrary may learn much from him. And now to come to those qualities in which David excels over Porthos. The first is that he is no snob, but esteems the girl Irene, pretentiously called his nurse, more than any fine lady, and envies every ragged boy who can hit to leg. Whereas Porthos would have every class keep its place, and though fond of going down into the kitchen, always barks at the top of the stairs for a servile invitation before he graciously descends. Most of the servants in our street have had the loan of him, to be photographed with, and I have but now seen him stalking off for that purpose, with a proud little housemaid, who is looking up to him as if he were a warrior for whom she had paid a shilling. Again, when David and Porthos are in their bath, praise is due to the one and must be withheld from the other. For David, as I have noticed, loves to splash in his bath, and to slip back into it from the hands that would transfer him to a towel, but Porthos stands in his bath drooping abjectly, like a shamed figure cut out of some limp material. Furthermore, the inventiveness of David is beyond that of Porthos, who cannot play by himself, and knows not even how to take a solitary walk, while David invents playfully all day long. Lastly, when David is discovered of some offence and expresses sorrow therefor, he does that thing no more for a time, but looks about him for other offences, whereas Porthos incontinently repeats his offence. In other words, he again buries his bone in the backyard, and marvels greatly that I know it, although his nose be crusted with earth. Touching these matters, therefore, let it be granted that David excels Porthos, and in divers similar qualities the one is no more than a match for the other, as in the quality of curiosity. For, if a parcel comes into my chambers, Porthos is miserable until it is opened, and I have noticed the same thing of David. Also there is the taking of medicine, for at production of the vial all gaiety suddenly departs from Porthos, and he looks the other way, but if I say I have forgotten to have the vial refilled, he skips joyfully, yet thinks he still has a right to a chocolate. And when I remarked disparagingly on this to David, he looked so shy that there was revealed to me a picture of a certain lady treating him for youthful maladies. A thing to be considered of in both is their receiving of punishments, and I am now reminded that the girl Irene, whom I take in this matter to be your mouthpiece, complains that I am not sufficiently severe with David, and do leave the chiding of him for offences against myself to her, in the hope that he will love her less and me more thereby, which we have hotly argued in the gardens, to the detriment of our dignity. And I here say that if I am slow to be severe to David, the reason thereof is that I dare not be severe to Porthos, and I have ever sought to treat the one the same with the other. Now I refrain from raising hand or voice to Porthos, because his great heart is nigh to breaking, if he so much as suspects that all is not well between him and me, and having struck him once some years ago, never can I forget the shudder which passed through him when he saw it was I who had struck, and I shall strike him, ma'am, no more. But when he is detected in any unseemly act now, it is my stern practice to cane my writing table in his presence, and even this punishment is almost more than he can bear. Wherefore, if such chastisement inflicted on David encourages him but to enter upon fresh trespasses, as the girl Irene avers, the reason must be that his heart is not like unto that of the noble Porthos. And if you retort that David is naturally a depraved little boy, and so demands harsher measure, I have still my answer, to wit, what is the manner of severity meted out to him at home? Unless you should shuffle in your reply, I shall mention a notable passage that has come to my ears. As thus, that David, having heard a horrid word in the street, uttered it with unction in the home, that the mother threatened corporal punishment, whereat the father tremblingly intervened, that David continued to rejoice exceedingly in his word, the father spoke darkly of a cane, but the mother rushed between the combatants, that the problematical chastisement became to David an object of romantic interest, that this darkened the happy home, that casting from his path a weeping mother, the goaded father at last dashed from the house, yelling that he was away to buy a cane, that he merely walked the streets white to the lips because of the terror David must now be feeling, and that when he returned it was David, radiant with hope, who opened the door, and then burst into tears because there was no cane. Truly, ma'am, you are a fitting person to tax me with want of severity. Rather should you be giving thanks that it is not you I am comparing with Porthos. But to make an end of this comparison, I mention that Porthos is ever wishful to express gratitude for my kindness to him, so that looking up from my book, I see his mournful eyes fixed upon me with a passionate attachment, and then I know that the well-nigh unbearable sadness which comes into the face of dogs is because they cannot say thank you to their masters, whereas David takes my kindness as his right, But for this, while I should chide him, I cannot do so, for of all the ways David has of making me to love him, the most poignant is that he expects it of me as a matter of course. David is all for fun, but none may plumb the depths of Porthos. Nevertheless, I am most nearly doing so when I lie down beside him on the floor, and he puts an arm about my neck. On my soul, ma'am, a protecting arm. At such times it is as if each of us knew what was the want of the other. Thus weighing Porthos with David, it were hard to tell which is the worthier. Wherefore, do you keep your boy while I keep my dog, and so we shall both be pleased. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Little White Bird. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sandra. The Little White Bird by J. M. Barrie. Chapter 21. Chapter 21. William Paterson. We had been together, we three, in my rooms, David telling me about the fairy language, and Porthos lolling on the sofa listening, as one may say. It is his favourite place of a dull day, and under him were some sheets of newspaper, which I spread there at such times to deceive my housekeeper, who thinks dogs should lie on the floor. "Fairy me tribber" is what you say to the fairies when you want them to give you a cup of tea, but it is not so easy as it looks, for all the R's should be pronounced as W's, and I forget this so often that David believes I should find difficulty in making myself understood. "What would you say," he asked me, "if you wanted them to turn you into a hollyhock?" He thinks the ease with which they can turn you into things is their most engaging quality. The answer is "Fairy me Luca," but though he had often told me this, I again forgot the Luca. "I should never dream," I said, to cover my discomfiture, "of asking them to turn me into anything. If I was a hollyhock I should soon wither, David." He himself had provided me with this objection not long before, but now he seemed to think it merely silly. "Just before the time to wither begins," he said airily, "you say to them, 'Fairy me bola.' 'Fairy me bola' means 'turn me back again,' and David's discovery made me uncomfortable, for I knew he had hitherto kept his distance of the fairies, mainly because of a feeling that their conversations are permanent. So I returned him to his home. I sent him home from my rooms under the care of Porthos. I may walk on the other side unknown to them, but they have no need of me, for at such times nothing would induce Porthos to depart from the care of David. If anyone addresses them he growls softly, and shows the teeth that crunch bones as if they were biscuits. Thus, amicably, the two pass on to Mary's house, where Porthos barks his knock and ring bark till the door is opened. Sometimes he goes in with David, but on this occasion he said good-bye on the step. Nothing remarkable in this, but he did not return to me, not that day, nor next day, nor in weeks and months. I was a man distraught, and David wore his knuckles in his eyes. Conceive it, we had lost our dear Porthos, at least, well, something disquieting happened. I don't quite know what to think of it even now. I know what David thinks. However, you shall think as you choose. My first hope was that Porthos had strolled to the gardens and got locked in for the night, and almost as soon as lock-out was over I was there to make inquiries. But there was no news of Porthos, though I learned that someone was believed to have spent the night in the gardens, a young gentleman who walked out hastily the moment the gates were opened. He had said nothing, however, of having seen a dog. I feared an accident now, for I knew no thief could steal him, yet even an accident seemed incredible. He was always so cautious at crossings. Also, there could not possibly have been an accident to Porthos without there being an accident to something else. David, in the middle of his games, would suddenly remember the great blank and step aside to cry. It was one of his qualities that when he knew he was about to cry, he turned aside to do it, and I always respected his privacy and waited for him. Of course, being but a little boy, he was soon playing again, but his sudden floods of feeling, of which we never spoke, were dear to me in those desolate days. We had a favourite haunt called the Story Seat, and we went back to that, meaning not to look at the grass near it where Porthos used to squat, but we could not help looking at it sideways, and to our distress a man was sitting on the acquainted spot. He rose at our approach and took 2 steps towards us, so quick that they were almost jumps. Then, as he saw that we were passing indignantly, I thought I heard him give a little cry. I put him down for one of your garrulous fellows who try to lure strangers into talk, but next day when we found him sitting on the Story Seat itself, I had a longer scrutiny of him. He was dandiacally dressed, seemed to tell something under 20 years, and had a handsome wistful face, atop of a heavy, lumbering, almost corpulent figure, which however did not betoken inactivity, for David's purple hat, a conceit of his mother's of which we were both heartily ashamed, blowing off as we neared him, he leapt the railings without touching them, and was back with it in 3 seconds. Only instead of delivering it straightway, he seemed to expect David to chase him for it. You have introduced yourself to David when you jumped the railings without touching them, and William Pattison, as proved to be his name, was at once our friend. We often found him waiting for us at the Story Seat, and the great stout fellow laughed and wept over our tales like a 3-year-old. Often he said with extraordinary pride, "You are telling the story to me quite as much to David, aren't you?" He was of an innocence such as you shall seldom encounter, and believed stories at which even David blinked. Often he looked at me in quick alarm if David said that of course these things did not really happen, and unable to resist that appeal, I would reply that they really did. I never saw him irate except when David was still sceptical, but then he would say quite warningly, "He says it is true, so it must be true." This brings me to that one of his qualities which at once gratified and pained me, his admiration for myself. His eyes, which at times had a rim of red, were ever fixed upon me fondly, except perhaps when I told him of Porthos, and said that death alone could have kept him so long from my side. Then Pattison's sympathy was such that he had to look away. He was shy of speaking of himself, so I asked him no personal questions, but concluded that his upbringing must have been lonely, to account for his ignorance of affairs, and loveless, else how could he have felt such a drawing to me? I remember very well the day when the strange and surely monstrous suspicion first made my head tingle. We had been blown, the 3 of us, to my rooms by a gust of rain. It was also, I think, the first time Pattison had entered them. "Take the sofa, Mr. Pattison," I said, as I drew a chair nearer to the fire, and for the moment my eyes were off him. Then I saw that before sitting down on the sofa he was spreading the day's paper over it. "Whatever makes you do that?" I asked, and he started like one bewildered by the question, then went white and pushed the paper aside. David had noticed nothing, but I was strangely uncomfortable, and despite my efforts at talk, often lapsed into silence, to be roused from it by a feeling that Pattison was looking at me covertly. Pooh! What vapours of the imagination were these? I blew them from me, and to prove to myself, so to speak, that they were dissipated, I asked him to see David home. As soon as I was alone, I flung me down on the floor laughing, then as quickly jumped up and was after them, and very sober too, for it was come to me abruptly as an odd thing that Paterson had set off without asking where David lived. Seeing them in front of me, I crossed the street and followed. They were walking side by side rather solemnly, and perhaps nothing remarkable happened until they reached David's door. I say perhaps, for something did occur. A lady who has several pretty reasons for frequenting the gardens recognized David in the street and was stooping to address him when Paterson did something that alarmed her. I was too far off to see what it was, but had he growled "hands off," she could not have scurried away more precipitately. He then ponderously marched his charge to the door, where assuredly he did a strange thing. Instead of knocking or ringing, he stood on the step and called out sharply, "Hi, hi, hi," until the door was opened. The whimsy, for it could be nothing more, curtailed me of my sleep that night, and you may picture me trying both sides of the pillow. I recalled other queer things of Paterson, and they came back to me charged with new meanings. There was his way of shaking hands. He now did it in the ordinary way, but when first we knew him, his arm had described a circle, and the hand had sometimes missed mine and come heavily upon my chest instead. His walk, again, might more correctly have been called a waddle. There were his perfervid thanks. He seldom departed without thanking me, with an intensity that was out of proportion to the little I had done for him. In the gardens, too, he seemed ever to take the sward rather than the seats, perhaps a wise preference, but he had an unusual way of sitting down. I can describe it only by saying that he let go of himself and went down with a thud. I reverted to the occasion when he lunched with me at the club. We had cutlets, and I noticed that he ate his in somewhat finicking manner, yet having left the table for a moment to consult the sweets card, I saw, when I returned, that there was now no bone on his plate. The waiters were looking at him rather curiously. David was very partial to him, but showed it in a somewhat singular manner, used to pat his head, for instance. I remembered also that while David shouted to me or Irene to attract our attention, he usually whistled to Paterson. He could not explain why. These ghosts made me sweat in bed, not merely that night, but often when some new shock brought them back in force. Yet unsupported, they would have disturbed me little by day. Day, however, had its reflections, and they came to me while I was shaving. That 10 minutes when, brought face to face with the harsher realities of life, we see things most clearly as they are. Then the beautiful nature of Paterson loomed offensively, and his honest eyes insulted over me. No one come to nigh 20 years had a right to such faith in his fellow creatures. He could not backbite, nor envy, nor prevaricate, nor jump at mean motives for generous acts. He had not a single base story about women. It all seemed inhuman. What creatures we be! I was more than half ashamed of Paterson's faith in me, but when I saw it begin to shrink, I fought for it. An easy task, you may say, but it was a hard one, for gradually a change had come over the youth. I am now arrived at a time when the light-heartedness had gone out of him. He had lost his zest for fun, and dubiety sat in the eyes that were once so certain. He was not doubtful of me, not then, but of human nature in general. That whilom noble edifice was tottering. He mixed with boys in the gardens. Ah, mothers, it is hard to say, but how could he retain his innocence when he had mixed with boys? He heard your talk of yourselves, and so, ladies, that part of the edifice went down. I have not the heart to follow him in all his discoveries. Sometimes he went in flame at them, but for the most part he stood looking on, bewildered and numbed, like one moaning inwardly. He saw all as one fresh to the world, before he had time to breathe upon the glass. So would your child be, madam, if born with a man's powers, and when disillusioned of all else, he would cling for a moment longer to you, the woman of whom, before he saw you, he had heard so much. How you would strive to cheat him, even as I strove to hide my real self from Paterson, and still you would strive as I strove after you knew the game was up. The sorrowful eyes of Paterson stripped me bare. There were days when I could not endure looking at him, though surely I have long ceased to be a vain man. He still met us in the gardens, but for hours he and I would be together without speaking. It was so upon the last day, one of those innumerable dreary days when David, having sneezed the night before, was kept at home in flannel, and I sat alone with Paterson on the story seat. At last I turned to address him. Never had we spoken of what chained our tongues, and I meant only to say now that we must go, for soon the gates would close. But when I looked at him I saw that he was more mournful than ever before. He shut his eyes so tightly that a drop of blood fell from them. "It was all over, Paterson, long ago," I broke out harshly. "Why do we linger?" He beat his hands together miserably, and yet cast me appealing looks that had much affection in them. "You expected too much of me," I told him, and he bowed his head. "I don't know where you brought your grand ideas of men and women from. I don't want to know," I added hastily. "But it must have been from a prettier world than this," I said. "Are you quite sure that you were wise in leaving it?" He rose and sat down again. "I wanted to know you," he replied slowly. "I wanted to be like you." "And now you know me," I said, "do you want to be like me still? I am a curious person to attach oneself to, Paterson. Don't you see that? Even David often smiles at me when he thinks he is unobserved. I work very hard to retain that little boy's love, but I shall lose him soon. Even now I am not what I was to him. In a year or two at longest, Paterson, David will grow out of me." The poor fellow shot out his hand to me, but "No," said I, "you have found me out. Everybody finds me out except my dog, and that is why the loss of him makes such a difference to me. Shall we go, Paterson?" He would not come with me, and I left him on the seat. When I was far away I looked back, and he was still sitting there forlornly. For long I could not close my ears that night. I lay listening, I knew not what for. A scare was on me that made me dislike the dark, and I switched on the light and slept at last. I was roused by a great to-do in the early morning, servants knocking excitedly, and my door opened, and the dear Porthos I had mourned so long tore in. They had heard his bark, but whence he came no one knew. He was in excellent condition, and after he had leaped upon me from all points, I flung him on the floor by a trick I know, and lay down beside him, while he put his protecting arm round me, and looked at me with the old adoring eyes. But we never saw Paterson again. You may think as you choose. End of chapter 21.
Chapter 22 of The Little White Bird. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. The Little White Bird by J. M. Barrie. Chapter 22. Joey. Wise children always choose a mother who was a shocking flirt in her maiden days, and so had several offers before she accepted their fortunate papa. The reason they do this is because every offer refused by their mother means another pantomime to them. You see, you can't trust to your father's taking you to the pantomime, But you can trust to every one of the poor frenzied gentlemen for whom that lady has wept a delicious little tear on her lovely little cambric handkerchief. It is pretty, but dreadfully affecting, to see them on Boxing Night gathering together the babies of their old loves. Some knock at but one door and bring a hansom, but others go from street to street in private busses, and even wear false noses to conceal the sufferings you inflict upon them as you grew more and more like your sweet, cruel mamma. So I took David to the pantomime, and I hope you will follow my reasoning, for I don't. He went with the fairest anticipations, pausing on the threshold to peer through the hole in the little house called Pay Here, which he thought was Red Riding Hood's residence, and asked politely whether he might see her. But they said she had gone to the wood, and it was quite true, for there she was in the wood gathering a stick for her grandmother's fire. She sang a beautiful song about the boys and their dashing ways, which flattered David considerably, but she forgot to take away the stick after all. Other parts of the play were not so nice, but David thought it all lovely. He really did. Yet he left the place in tears. All the way home he sobbed in the darkest corner of the growler, and if I tried to comfort him, he struck me. The clown had done it, that man of whom he expected things so fair. He had asked in a loud voice of the middling funny gentleman, when in the middle of a song, whether he thought Joey would be long in coming, and when at last Joey did come, he screamed out, "How d'ye do, Joey?" and went into convulsions of mirth. Joey and his father were shadowing a pork-butcher's shop, pocketing the sausages, for which their family has such a fatal weakness, and so when the butcher engaged Joey as his assistant, there was soon not a sausage left. However, this did not matter, for there was a box rather like an ice-cream machine, and you put chunks of pork in at one end, and turned a handle, and they came out as sausages at the other end. Joey quite enjoyed doing this, and you could see that the sausages were excellent by the way he licked his fingers after touching them. But soon there were no more pieces of pork, and just then a dear little Irish terrier dog came trotting down the street. So what did Joey do but pop it into the machine, and it came out at the other end as sausages. It was this callous act that turned all David's mirth to woe, and drove us weeping to our growler. Heaven knows I have no wish to defend this cruel deed, but as Joey told me afterward, it is very difficult to say what they will think funny and what barbarous. I was forced to admit to him that David had perceived only the joyous in the pokering of the policeman's legs, and had called out heartily, "Do it again," every time Joey knocked the pantaloon down with one kick and helped him up with another. "It hurts the poor chap," I was told by Joey, whom I was agreeably surprised to find by no means wanting in the more humane feelings. And he wouldn't stand it if there wasn't the laugh to encourage him. He maintained that the dog got that laugh to encourage him also. However, he had not got it from David, whose mother and father and nurse combined could not comfort him, though they swore that the dog was still alive and kicking, which might all have been very well, had not David seen the sausages. It was to inquire whether anything could be done to atone that in considerable trepidation I sent in my card to the clown, and the result of our talk was that he invited me and David to have tea with him on Thursday next at his lodgings. "I shan't laugh," David said, nobly true to the memory of the little dog. "I shan't laugh once," and he closed his jaws very tightly as we drew near the house in Soho where Joey lodged. But he also gripped my hand like one who knew that it would be an ordeal not to laugh. The house was rather like the ordinary kind, but there was a convenient sausage shop exactly opposite, trust Joey for that, and we saw a policeman in the street looking the other way, as they always do look just before you rob them. A woman wearing the same kind of clothes as people in other houses wear, told us to go up to the second floor, and she grinned at David, as if she had heard about him. So up we went, David muttering through his clenched teeth, "I shan't laugh." And as soon as we knocked, a voice called out, "Here we are again," at which a shudder passed through David, as if he feared that he had set himself an impossible task. In we went, however, and though the voice had certainly come from this room, we found nobody there. I looked in bewilderment at David, and he quickly put his hand over his mouth. It was a funny room, of course, but not so funny as you might expect. There were droll things in it, but they did nothing funny. You could see that they were just waiting for Joey. There were padded chairs with friendly-looking rents down the middle of them, and a table and a horsehair sofa, and we sat down very cautiously on the sofa, but nothing happened to us. The biggest piece of furniture was an enormous wicker trunk, with a very lively coloured stocking dangling out at a hole in it, and a notice on the top that Joey was the funniest man on earth. David tried to pull the stocking out of the hole, but it was so long that it never came to an end, and when it measured 6 times the length of the room, he had to cover his mouth again. "I'm not laughing," he said to me, quite fiercely. He even managed not to laugh, though he did gulp, when we discovered on the mantelpiece a photograph of Joey in ordinary clothes, the garments he wore before he became a clown. You can't think how absurd he looked in them, but David didn't laugh. Suddenly Joey was standing beside us. It could not have been more sudden, though he had come from beneath the table, and he was wearing his pantomime clothes, which he told us afterward were the only clothes he had, and his red and white face was so funny that David made gurgling sounds, which were his laugh trying to force a passage. I introduced David, who offered his hand stiffly, but Joey, instead of taking it, put out his tongue and waggled it, and this was so droll that David had again to save himself by clapping his hand over his mouth. Joey thought he had toothache, so I explained what it truly meant, and then Joey said, "Oh, I shall soon make him laugh," whereupon the following conversation took place between them. "No, you shan't," said David, doggedly. "Yes, I shall." "No, you shan't." "Yes, I shall so." "Shan't, shan't, shan't." "Shall, shall, shall." "You shut up. You're another." By this time Joey was in a frightful way, because he was getting the worst of it, and he boasted that he had David's laugh in his pocket, and David challenged him to produce it, and Joey searched his pockets and brought out the most unexpected articles, including a duck and a bunch of carrots, and you could see by his manner that the simple soul thought these were things which all boys carried loose in their pockets. I dare say David would have had to laugh in the end, had there not been a half-gnawed sausage in one of the pockets, and the sight of it reminded him so cruelly of the poor dog's fate that he howled, and Joey's heart was touched at last, and he also wept, but he wiped his eyes with the duck. It was at this touching moment that the pantaloon hobbled in, also dressed as we had seen him last night, and carrying, unfortunately, a trayful of sausages, which at once increased the general gloom, for he announced in his squeaky voice that they were the very sausages that had lately been the dog. Then Joey seemed to have a great idea, and his excitement was so impressive that we stood gazing at him. First he counted the sausages, and said that they were 2 short, and he found the missing 2 up the pantaloon sleeve. Then he ran out of the room, and came back with the sausage machine, and what do you think he did? He put all the sausages into the end of the machine that they had issued from, and turned the handle backward, and then out came the dog at the other end. Can you picture the joy of David? He clasped the dear little terrier in his arms, and then we noticed that there was a sausage adhering to his tail. The pantaloon said we must have put in a sausage too many, but Joey said the machine had not worked quite smoothly, and that he feared this sausage was the dog's bark, which distressed David, for he saw how awkward it must be to a dog to have its bark outside, and we were considering what should be done when the dog closed the discussion by swallowing the sausage. After that David had the most hilarious hour of his life, entering into the childish pleasures of this family as heartily as if he had been brought up on sausages, and knocking the pantaloon down repeatedly. You must not think that he did this viciously. He did it to please the old gentleman, who begged him to do it, and always shook his hand warmly and said "Thank you" when he had done it. They are quite a simple people. Joey called David and me Sonny, and asked David, who addressed him as Mr. Clown, to call him Joey. He also told us that the pantaloon's name was Old Joey, and the Columbine's Josie, and the Harlequin's Joeykin. We were sorry to hear that old Joey gave him a good deal of trouble. This was because his memory is so bad that he often forgets whether it is your head or your feet you should stand on, and he usually begins the day by standing on the end that happens to get out of bed first. Thus he requires constant watching, and the worst of it is you dare not draw attention to his mistake, he is so shrinkingly sensitive about it. No sooner had Joey told us this than the poor old fellow began to turn upside down and stood on his head, but we pretended not to notice, and talked about the weather until he came to. Josie and Joeykin, all skirts and spangles, were with us by this time, for they had been invited to tea. They came in dancing, and danced off and on most of the time. Even in the middle of what they were saying they would begin to flutter. It was not so much that they meant to dance, as that the slightest thing set them going, such as sitting in a draught, and David found he could blow them about the room like pieces of paper. He could see by the shortness of Josie's dress that she was very young indeed, and at first this made him shy, as he always is when introduced formally to little girls, and he stood sucking his thumb, and so did she, but soon the stiffness wore off, and they sat together on the sofa, holding each other's hands. All this time the Harlequin was rotating like a beautiful fish, and David requested him to jump through the wall, at which he is such an adept. And first he said he would, and then he said he'd better not, for the last time he did it the people in the next house had made such a fuss. David had to admit that it must be rather startling to the people on the other side of the wall, but he was sorry. By this time tea was ready, and Josie, who poured out, remembered to ask if you took milk with just one drop of tea in it, exactly as her mother would have asked. There was nothing to eat, of course, except sausages, but what a number of them there were! Hundreds at least, strings of sausages, and every now and then Joey jumped up and played skipping rope with them. David had been taught not to look greedy, even though he felt greedy, and he was shocked to see the way in which Joey and old Joey, and even Josie, eyed the sausages they had given him. Soon Josie developed nobler feelings, for she and Joeykin suddenly fell madly in love with each other across the table, but, unaffected by this pretty picture, Joey continued to put whole sausages in his mouth at a time, and then rubbed himself a little lower down, while old Joey secreted them about his person. And when David wasn't looking, they both pounced on his sausages, and yet as they gobbled they were constantly running to the top of the stair and screaming to the servant to bring up more sausages. You could see that Joey, if you caught him with his hand on your plate, was a bit ashamed of himself, and he admitted to us that sausages were a passion with him. He said he had never once in his life had a sufficient number of sausages. They had maddened him since he was the smallest boy. He told us how, even in those days, his mother had feared for him, though fond of a sausage herself; how he had bought a sausage with his first penny, and hoped to buy one with his last, if they could not be got in any other way, and that he always slept with a string of them beneath his pillow. While he was giving us these confidences, unfortunately, his eyes came to rest, at first accidentally, then wistfully, then with a horrid gleam in them, on the little dog, which was fooling about on the top of the sausage-machine, and his hands went out toward it convulsively, whereat David, in sudden fear, seized the dog in one arm and gallantly clenched his other fist, and then Joey begged his pardon and burst into tears, each one of which he flung against the wall, where it exploded with a bang. David refused to pardon him unless he promised on wood never to look in that way at the dog again. But Joey said promises were nothing to him when he was short of sausages, and so his wisest course would be to present the dog to David. Oh, the joy of David when he understood that the little dog he had saved was his very own! I can tell you he was now in a hurry to be off before Joey had time to change his mind. "All I ask of you," Joey said with a break in his voice, "is to call him after me, and always to give him a sausage, sonny, of a Saturday night." There was a quiet dignity about Joey at the end which showed that he might have risen to high distinction but for his fatal passion. The last we saw of him was from the street. He was waving his tongue at us in his attractive, foolish way, and Josie was poised on Joachim's hand like a butterfly that had alighted on a flower. We could not exactly see old Joey, but we saw his feet, and so feared the worst. Of course they are not everything they should be, but one can't help liking them. End of chapter 22.
Chapter 23 of The Little White Bird. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sandra. The Little White Bird by J.M. Barrie. Chapter 23. Chapter 23. Pilkingtons. On attaining the age of 8 or thereabout, children fly away from the gardens and never come back. When next you meet them they are ladies and gentlemen holding up their umbrellas to hail a hansom. Where the girls go to I know not, to some private place I suppose, to put up their hair, but the boys have gone to Pilkingtons. He is a man with a cane. You may not go to Pilkingtons in knickerbockers made by your mother, make she ever so artfully. They must be real knickerbockers, it is his stern rule. Hence the fearful fascination of Pilkingtons. He may be conceived as one who, baiting his hook with real knickerbockers, fishes all day in the gardens, which are to him but a pool swarming with small fry. Abhorred shade! I know not what manner of man thou art in the flesh, sir, but figure thee bearded and black of eyes, and of a lean tortuous habit of body, that moves ever with a swish. Every morning, I swear, thou readest avidly the list of male births in thy paper, and then are thy hands rubbed gloatingly the one upon the other. 'Tis fear of thee and thy gown and thy cane, which are part of thee, that make the fairies to hide by day. Wert thou to linger but once among their haunts, between the hours of lock-out and open gates, there would be left not one single gentle place in all the gardens. The little people would flit, how much wiser they than the small boys who swim glamoured to thy crafty hook. Thou devastator of the gardens, I know thee, Pilkington. I first heard of Pilkington from David, who had it from Oliver Bailey. This Oliver Bailey was one of the most dashing figures in the gardens, and without apparent effort was daily drawing nearer the completion of his 7th year, at a time when David seemed unable to get beyond 5:30. I have to speak of him in the past tense, for gone is Oliver from the gardens, gone to Pilkingtons, but he is still a name among us, and some lordly deeds are remembered of him, as that his father shaved twice a day. Oliver himself was all on that scale. His not ignoble ambition seems always to have been wrecked upon an island. Indeed, I am told that he mentioned it insinuatingly in his prayers, and it was perhaps inevitable that a boy with such an outlook should fascinate David. I am proud, therefore, to be able to state on wood that it was Oliver himself who made the overture. On first hearing from some satellite of Oliver's of wrecked islands, as they are called in the Gardens, David said wistfully that he supposed you needed to be very, very good before you had any chance of being wrecked, and the remark was conveyed to Oliver, on whom it made an uncomfortable impression. For a time he tried to evade it, but ultimately David was presented to him and invited gloomily to say it again. The upshot was that Oliver advertised the Gardens of his intention to be good until he was 8, and if he had not been wrecked by that time, to be as jolly bad as a boy could be. He was naturally so bad that at the kindergarten academy, when the mistress ordered whoever had done the last naughty deed to step forward, Oliver's custom had been to step forward, not necessarily because he had done it, but because he presumed he very likely had. The friendship of the two dated from this time, and at first I thought Oliver discovered generosity in hasting to David as to an equal. He also walked hand in hand with him, and even reproved him for delinquencies like a loving elder brother. But 'tis a grey world even in the Gardens, for I found that a new arrangement had been made which reduced Oliver to life-size. He had wearied of well-doing, and passed it on, so to speak, to his friend. In other words, on David now devolved the task of being good until he was 8, while Oliver clung to him so closely that the one could not be wrecked without the other. When this was made known to me, it was already too late to break the spell of Oliver. David was top-heavy with pride in him and faith. I began to find myself very much in the cold, for Oliver was frankly bored by me, and even David seemed to think it would be convenient if I went and sat with Irene. Am I affecting to laugh? I was really distressed and lonely and rather bitter, and how humble I became. Sometimes when the dog Joey is unable, by frisking, to induce Porthos to play with him, he stands on his hind legs and begs it of him, and I do believe I was sometimes as humble as Joey. Then David would insist on my being suffered to join them, but it was plain that he had no real occasion for me. It was an unheroic trouble, and I despised myself. For years I had been fighting Mary for David, and had not wholly failed, though she was advantaged by the accident of relationship. Was I now to be knocked out so easily by a 7-year-old? I reconsidered my weapons, and I fought Oliver and beat him. Figure to yourself those two boys become as faithful to me as my coat-tails. With wrecked islands I did it. I began in the most unpretentious way, by telling them a story which might last an hour, and favoured by many an unexpected wind, it lasted 18 months. It started as the wreck of the simple Swiss family, who looked up and saw the butter tree, but soon a glorious inspiration of the night turned it into the wreck of David A. and Oliver Bailey. At first it was what they were to do when they were wrecked, but imperceptibly it became what they had done. I spent much of my time staring reflectively at the titles of the boys' stories in the booksellers' windows, whistling for a breeze, so to say, for I found that the titles were even more helpful than the stories. We wrecked everybody of note, including all Homer's most taking characters and the hero of Paradise Lost. But we suffered them not to land. We stripped them of what we wanted, and left them to wander the high seas, naked of adventure. And all this was merely the beginning. By this time I had been cast upon the island. It was not my own proposal, but David knew my wishes, and he made it all right for me with Oliver. They found me among the breakers with a large dog, which had kept me afloat throughout that terrible night. I was the sole survivor of the ill-fated Anna Pink. So exhausted was I that they had to carry me to their hut, and great was my gratitude when, on opening my eyes, I found myself in that romantic edifice instead of in Davy Jones's locker. As we walked in the gardens, I told them of the hut they had built, and they were inflated but not surprised. On the other hand, they looked for surprise from me. "Did we tell you about the turtle we turned on its back?" asked Oliver, reverting to deeds of theirs of which I had previously told them. "You did? Who turned it?" demanded David, not as one who needed information, but after the manner of a schoolmaster. "It was turned," I said, "by David A., the younger of the two youths." "Who made the monkeys fling coconuts at him?" asked the older of the two youths. "Oliver Bailey," I replied. "Was it Oliver," asked David sharply, "that found the coconut tree first?" "On the contrary," I answered, "it was first observed by David, who immediately climbed it, remarking, 'This is certainly the Cocos nucifera, for see, dear Oliver, the slender columns supporting the crown of leaves, which fall with a grace that no art can imitate.'" "That's what I said," remarked David with a wave of his hand. "I said things like that too," Oliver insisted. "No, you didn't then," said David. "Yes, I did so." "No, you didn't so." "Shut up." "Well then, let's hear one you said." Oliver looked appealingly at me. "The following," I announced, "is one that Oliver said. 'Truly, dear comrade, though the perils of these happenings are great, and our privations calculated to break the stoutest heart, yet to be rewarded by such fair sights I would endure still greater trials, and still rejoice even as the bird on yonder bough.'" "That's one I said," crowed Oliver. "I shot the bird," said David instantly. "What bird?" "The yonder bird." "No, you didn't." "Did I not shoot the bird?" "It was David who shot the bird," I said, "but it was Oliver who saw it by its multicoloured plumage, that it was one of the Psittacidae, an excellent substitute for partridge." "You didn't see that," said Oliver, rather swollen. "Yes, I did." "What did you see?" "I saw that." "What?" "You shut up." "David shot it," I summed up, "and Oliver knew its name, but I ate it. Do you remember how hungry I was?" "Rather," said David. "I cooked it," said Oliver. "It was served up on toast," I reminded them. "I toasted it," said David. "Toast from the breadfruit tree," I said, "which, as you both remarked simultaneously, bears 2 and sometimes 3 crops in a year, and also affords a serviceable gum for the pitching of canoes." "I pitched mine best," said Oliver. "I pitched mine farthest," said David. "And when I had finished my repast," said I, "you amazed me by handing me a cigar from the tobacco plant." "I handed it," said Oliver. "I snicked off the end," said David. "And then," said I, "you gave me a light." "Which of us?" they cried together. "Both of you," I said. "Never shall I forget my amazement when I saw you get that light by rubbing 2 sticks together." At this they waggled their heads. "You couldn't have done it," said David. "No, David," I admitted, "I can't do it. But of course I know that all wrecked boys do it quite easily. Show me how you did it." But after consulting apart they agreed not to show me. I was not shown everything. David was now firmly convinced that he had once been wrecked on an island, while Oliver passed his days in dubiety. They used to argue it out together and among their friends. As I unfolded the story, Oliver listened with an open knife in his hand, and David, who was not allowed to have a knife, wore a pirate string round his waist. Irene, in her usual interfering way, objected to this bauble and dropped disparaging remarks about wrecked islands, which were little to her credit. I was for defying her, but David, who had the knack of women, knew a better way. He craftily proposed that we should let Irene in short, should wreck her, and though I objected, she proved a great success and recognized the yucca filamentosa by its long narrow leaves the very day she joined us. Thereafter we had no more scoffing from Irene, who listened to the story as hotly as anybody. This encouraged us in time to let in David's father and mother, though they never knew it unless he told them, as I have no doubt he did. They were admitted primarily to gratify David, who was very soft-hearted and knew that while he was on the island they must be missing him very much at home. So we let them in, and there was no part of the story he liked better than that which told of the joyous meeting. We were in need of another woman at any rate, someone more romantic looking than Irene, and Mary, I can assure her now, had a busy time of it. She was constantly being carried off by cannibals, and David became quite an adept at plucking her from the very pot itself and springing from cliff to cliff with his lovely burden in his arms. There was seldom a Saturday in which David did not kill his man. I shall now provide the proof that David believed it all to be as true as true. It was told me by Oliver, who had it from our hero himself. I had described to them how the savages had tattooed David's father, and Oliver informed me that one night shortly afterward David was discovered softly lifting the blankets off his father's legs to have a look at the birds and reptiles etched thereon. Thus many months passed with no word of Pilkington, and you may be asking where he was all this time. Ah, my friends, he was very busy fishing, though I was as yet unaware of his existence. Most suddenly I heard the whir of his hated reel as he struck a fish. I remember that grim day with painful vividness. It was a wet day. Indeed, I think it has rained for me more or less ever since. As soon as they joined me, I saw from the manner of the two boys that they had something to communicate. Oliver nudged David and retired a few paces, whereupon David said to me solemnly, "Oliver is going to Pilkington's." I immediately perceived that it was some school, but so little did I understand the import of David's remark that I called out jocularly, "I hope he won't swish you, Oliver." Evidently I had pained both of them, for they exchanged glances and retired for consultation behind a tree, whence David returned to say with emphasis, "He has 2 jackets and 2 shirts and 2 knickerbockers, all real ones." "Well done, Oliver," said I, but it was the wrong thing again, and once more they disappeared behind the tree. Evidently they decided that the time for plain speaking was come, for now David announced bluntly, "He wants you not to call him Oliver any longer." "What shall I call him?" "Bailey." "But why?" "He's going to Pilkington's, and he can't play with us any more after next Saturday." "Why not?" "He's going to Pilkington's." So now I knew the law about the thing, and we moved on together, Oliver stretching himself consciously, and methought that even David walked with a sedater air. "David," said I, with a sinking, "are you going to Pilkington's?" "When I am 8," he replied. "And shan't I call you David then, and won't you play with me in the gardens any more?" He looked at Bailey, and Bailey signalled him to be firm. "Oh no," said David cheerily. Thus sharply did I learn how much longer I was to have of him. Strange that a little boy can give so much pain. I dropped his hand and walked on in silence, and presently I did my most churlish to hurt him by ending the story abruptly in a very cruel way. 10 years have elapsed, said I, since I last spoke, and our two heroes, now gay young men, are revisiting the wrecked island of their childhood. Did we wreck ourselves, said one, or was there someone to help us? And the other, who was the younger, replied, I think there was someone to help us, a man with a dog. I think he used to tell me stories in the Kensington Gardens, but I forget all about him. I don't remember even his name. This tame ending bored Bailey, and he drifted away from us, but David still walked by my side, and he was grown so quiet that I knew a storm was brewing. Suddenly he flashed lightning on me. It's not true, he cried. It's a lie. He gripped my hand. I shan't never forget you, father. Strange that a little boy can give so much pleasure. Yet I could go on. You will forget, David, but there was once a boy who would have remembered. Timothy, said he at once. He thinks Timothy was a real boy and is very jealous of him. He turned his back to me and stood alone, and wept passionately while I waited for him. You may be sure I begged his pardon, and made it all right with him, and had him laughing and happy again before I let him go. But nevertheless what I said was true. David is not my boy, and he will forget, but Timothy would have remembered. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Little White Bird. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sandra. The Little White Bird by J.M. Barrie. Chapter 24. Chapter 24. Barbara. Another shock was waiting for me farther down the story, for we had resumed our adventures, though we seldom saw Bailey now. At long intervals we met him on our way to or from the gardens, and, if there was none from Pilkington's to mark him, methought he looked at us somewhat longingly, as if beneath his real knickerbockers a morsel of the egg-shell still adhered. Otherwise he gave David a not unfriendly kick in passing, and called him youngster. That was about all. When Oliver disappeared from the life of the gardens, we had lofted him out of the story, and did very well without him, extending our operations to the mainland, where they were on so vast a scale that we were rapidly depopulating the earth. And then, said David one day, shall we let Barbara in? We had occasionally considered the giving of Bailey's place to some other child of the gardens, divers of David's year having sought election, even with bribes, but Barbara was new to me. Who is she? I asked. She's my sister. You may imagine how I gaped. She hasn't come yet, David said lightly, but she's coming. I was shocked. Not perhaps so much shocked as disillusioned, for though I had always suspicioned Mary A. as one who harboured the craziest ambitions when she looked most humble, of such presumption as this I had never thought her capable. I wandered across the broad walk to have a look at Irene, and she was wearing an unmistakable air. It set me reflecting about Mary's husband, and his manner the last time we met, for though I have had no opportunity to say so, we still meet now and again, and he has even dined with me at the club. On these occasions the subject of Timothy is barred, and if by any unfortunate accident Mary's name is mentioned, we immediately look opposite ways, and a silence follows, in which I feel sure he is smiling, and wonder what the deuce he is smiling at. I remembered now that I had last seen him when I was dining with him at his club, for he is become member of a club of painter fellows, and Mary is so proud of this that she has had it printed on his card, when undoubtedly he had looked preoccupied. It had been the look, I saw now, of one who shared a guilty secret. As all was thus suddenly revealed to me, I laughed unpleasantly at myself, for on my soul I had been thinking well of Mary of late. Always foolishly inflated about David, she had been grudging him even to me during these last weeks, and I had forgiven her, putting it down to a mother's love. I knew from the poor boy of unwanted treats she had been giving him. I had seen her embrace him furtively in a public place. Her every act, in so far as they were known to me, had been a challenge to whoever dare assert that she wanted anyone but David. How could I, not being a woman, have guessed that she was really saying good-bye to him? Reader, picture to yourself that simple little boy playing about the house at this time, on the understanding that everything was going on as usual. Have not his toys acquired a new pathos, especially the engine she bought him yesterday? Did you look him in the face, Mary, as you gave him that engine? I envy you not your feelings, ma'am, when with loving arms he wrapped you round for it. That childish confidence of his to me, in which unwittingly he betrayed you, indicates that at last you have been preparing him for the great change, and I suppose you are capable of replying to me that David is still happy, and even interested. But does he know from you what it really means to him? Rather, I do believe you are one who would not scruple to give him to understand that B, which you may yet find stands for Benjamin, is primarily a gift for him. In your heart, ma'am, what do you think of this tricking of a little boy? Suppose David had known what was to happen before he came to you, are you sure he would have come? Undoubtedly there is an unwritten compact in such matters between a mother and her firstborn, and I desire to point out to you that he never breaks it. Again, what will the other boys say when they know? You are outside the criticism of the Gardens, but David is not. Faith, madam, I believe you would have been kinder to wait and let him run the gauntlet at Pilkington's. You think your husband is a great man now, because they are beginning to talk of his foregrounds and middle distances in the newspaper columns that nobody reads. I know you have bought him a velvet coat, and that he has taken a large, airy, and commodious studio in Mews Lane, where you are to be found in a soft material on first and third Wednesdays. Times are changing, but shall I tell you a story here, just to let you see that I am acquainted with it? 3 years ago a certain gallery accepted from a certain artist a picture which he and his wife knew to be monstrous fine. But no one spoke of the picture, no one wrote of it, and no one made an offer for it. Crushed was the artist, sorry for the denseness of connoisseurs was his wife, till the work was bought by a dealer for an anonymous client, and then elated were they both, and relieved also to discover that I was not the buyer. He came to me at once to make sure of this, and remained to walk the floor gloriously as he told me what recognition means to gentlemen of the artistic callings. Oh, the happy boy! But months afterward, rummaging at his home in a closet that is usually kept locked, he discovered the picture, there hidden away. His wife backed into a corner and made a trembling confession. How could she submit to see her dear's masterpiece ignored by the idiot public, and her dear himself plunged into gloom thereby? She knew as well as he, for had they not been married for years, how the artistic instinct hungers for recognition, and so with her savings she bought the great work anonymously, and stored it away in a closet. At first I believe the man raved furiously, but by and by he was on his knees at the feet of this little darling. You know who she was, Mary, but, bless me, I seem to be praising you, and that was not the enterprise on which I set out. What I intended to convey was that though you can now venture on small extravagances, you seem to be going too fast. Look at it how one may, this Barbara idea is undoubtedly a bad business. How to be even with her, I cast about for a means, and on my lucky day I did conceive my final triumph over Mary, at which I have scarcely as yet dared to hint, lest by discovering it I should spoil my plot. For there has been a plot all the time. For long I had known that Mary contemplated the writing of a book, my informant being David, who, because I have published a little volume on military tactics, and am preparing a larger one on the same subject, which I shall never finish, likes to watch my methods of composition, how I dip, and so on, his desire being to help her. He may have done this on his own initiative, but it is also quite possible that in her desperation she urged him to it. He certainly implied that she had taken to book writing because it must be easy if I could do it. She also informed him, very inconsiderately, that I did not print my books myself, and this lowered me in the eyes of David, for it was for the printing he had admired me and boasted of me in the gardens. "I suppose you didn't make the boxes neither, nor yet the labels," he said to me, in the voice of one shorn of belief in everything. I should say here that my literary labours are abstruse, the token whereof is many rows of boxes nailed against my walls, each labelled with a letter of the alphabet. When I take a note in A, I drop it into the A box, and so on, much to the satisfaction of David, who likes to drop them in for me. I had now to admit that Wheeler and Gibb made the boxes. "But I made the labels myself, David." "They are not so well made as the boxes," he replied. Thus I have reason to wish ill to Mary's work of imagination, as I presumed it to be, and I said to him with easy brutality, "Tell her about the boxes, David, and that no one can begin a book until they are all full. That will frighten her." Soon thereafter he announced to me that she had got a box. "One box," I said with a sneer. "She made it herself," retorted David hotly. I got little real information from him about the work, partly because David loses his footing when he descends to the practical, and perhaps still more because he found me unsympathetic. But when he blurted out the title, The Little White Bird, I was like one who had read the book to its last page. I knew at once that the white bird was the little daughter Mary would fain have had. Somehow I had always known that she would like to have a little daughter. She was that kind of woman, and so long as she had the modesty to see that she could not have one, I sympathized with her deeply, whatever I may have said about her book to David. In those days Mary had the loveliest ideas for her sad little book, and they came to her mostly in the morning, when she was only 3 parts awake, but as she stepped out of bed they all flew away like startled birds. I gathered from David that this depressed her exceedingly. "Oh, Mary, your thoughts are much too pretty and holy to show themselves to anyone but yourself. The shy things are hiding within you. If they could come into the open, they would not be a book. They would be little Barbara." But that was not the message I sent her. "She will never be able to write it," I explained to David. "She has not the ability. Tell her I said that." I remembered now that for many months I had heard nothing of her ambitious project, so I questioned David and discovered that it was abandoned. He could not say why, nor was it necessary that he should. The trivial little reason was at once so plain to me. From that moment all my sympathy with Mary was spilled, and I searched for some means of exulting over her until I found it. It was this. I decided, unknown even to David, to write the book, The Little White Bird, of which she had proved herself incapable. And then, when, in the fullness of time, she held her baby on high, implying that she had done a big thing, I was to hold up the book. I venture to think that such a devilish revenge was never before planned and carried out. Yes, carried out, for this is the book rapidly approaching completion. She and I are running a neck-and-neck race. I have also once more brought the story of David's adventures to an abrupt end. And it really is the end this time, David, I said severely. I always say that. It ended on the coast of Patagonia, whither we had gone to shoot the great sloth, known to be the largest of animals, though we found his size to have been underestimated. David, his father, and I had flung our limbs upon the beach, and were having a last pipe before turning in, while Mary, attired in barbaric splendour, sang and danced before us. It was a lovely evening, and we lolled manlike, gazing, well content, at the pretty creature. The night was absolutely still, save for the roaring of the sloths in the distance. By and by Irene came to the entrance of our cave, where by the light of her torch we could see her exploring a shark that had been harpooned by David earlier in the day. Everything conduced to repose, and a feeling of gentle peace crept over us, from which we were roused by a shrill cry. It was uttered by Irene, who came speeding to us bearing certain articles: a watch, a pair of boots, a newspaper which she had discovered in the interior of the shark. What was our surprise to find in the newspaper intelligence of the utmost importance to all of us. It was nothing less than this: the birth of a new baby in London to Mary. How strange a method had Solomon chosen of sending us the news! The bald announcement at once plunged us into a fever of excitement, and next morning we set sail for England. Soon we came within sight of the white cliffs of Albion. Mary could not sit down for a moment, so hot was she to see her child. She paced the deck in an uncontrollable agitation. "So did I," cried David, when I had reached this point in the story. On arriving at the docks we immediately hailed a cab. "Never, David," I said, "shall I forget your mother's excitement. She kept putting her head out of the window and calling to the cabby to go quicker, quicker. How he lashed his horse! At last he drew up at your house, and then your mother, springing out, flew up the steps and beat with her hands upon the door. David was quite carried away by the reality of it. 'Father has the key!' he screamed. He opened the door," I said grandly, "and your mother rushed in, and next moment her Benjamin was in her arms." There was a pause. "Barbara," corrected David. "Benjamin," said I, doggedly. "Is that a girl's name?" "No, it's a boy's name. But mother wants a girl," he said, very much shaken. "Just like her presumption," I replied testily. "It is to be a boy, David, and you can tell her I said so." He was in a deplorable but most unselfish state of mind. A boy would have suited him quite well, but he put self aside altogether, and was pertinaciously solicitous that Mary should be given her fancy. "Barbara," he repeatedly implored me. "Benjamin," I replied firmly. For long I was obdurate, but the time was summer, and at last I agreed to play him for it. A 2 innings match. If he won, it was to be a girl, and if I won, it was to be a boy. End of chapter 24.
Chapter 25 of The Little White Bird. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. The Little White Bird by J.M. Barrie. The Cricket Match. I think there has not been so much on a cricket match since the day when Sir Horace Mann walked about Broad Halfpenny, agitatedly cutting down the daisies with his stick. And be it remembered, the heroes of Hambledon played for money and renown only, while David was champion of a lady. A lady! May we not prettily say of 2 ladies? There were no spectators of our contest, except now and again some loiterer in the gardens, who little thought what was the stake for which we played. But cannot we conceive Barbara standing at the ropes and agitatedly cutting down the daisies every time David missed the ball? I tell you, this was the historic match of the gardens. David wanted to play on a pitch near the round pond with which he is familiar. But this would have placed me at a disadvantage, so I insisted on unaccustomed ground, and we finally pitched stumps in the figs. We could not exactly pitch stumps, for they are forbidden in the gardens, but there are trees here and there which have chalk marks on them throughout the summer, and when you take up your position with a bat near one of these, you have really pitched stumps. The tree we selected is a ragged yew which consists of a broken trunk and 1 branch, and I viewed the ground with secret satisfaction, for it falls slightly at about 4 yards distance from the tree, and this exactly suits my style of bowling. I won the toss, and after examining the wicket, decided to take first knock. As a rule, when we play, the wit at first flows free. But on this occasion I strode to the crease in an almost eerie silence. David had taken off his blouse and rolled up his shirt sleeves, and his teeth were set. So I knew he would begin by sending me down some fast ones. His delivery is underarm and not inelegant, but he sometimes tries a round-arm ball, which I have seen double up the fielder at square leg. He has not a good length, but he varies his action bewilderingly, and has one especially teasing ball, which falls from the branches just as you have stepped out of your ground to look for it. It was not, however, with his teaser that he bowled me that day. I had notched a 3 and 2 singles when he sent me down a medium to fast, which got me in 2 minds, and I played back to it too late. Now I am seldom out on a really grassy wicket for such a meagre score, and as David and I changed places without a word, there was a cheery look on his face that I found very galling. He ran into my second ball and cut it neatly to the on for a single, and off my 5th and 6th he had 2 pretty drives for 3, both behind the wicket. This, however, as I hoped, proved the undoing of him, for he now hit out confidently at everything, and with his score at 9 I beat him with my shooter. The look was now on my face. I opened my second innings by treating him with uncommon respect, for I knew that his little arm soon tired if he was unsuccessful, and then when he sent me loose ones I banged them to the railings. What cared I though David's lips were twitching? When he ultimately got past my defence, with a jumpy one which broke awkwardly from the off, I had fetched 23, so that he needed 20 to win, a longer hand than he had ever yet made. As I gave him the bat, he looked brave, but something wet fell out of my hand, and then a sudden fear seized me lest David should not win. At the very outset, however, he seemed to master the bowling, and soon fetched about 10 runs in a classic manner. Then I tossed him a yorker, which he missed, and it went off at a tangent as soon as it had reached the tree. "Not out!" I cried hastily, for the face he turned to me was terrible. Soon thereafter another incident happened, which I shall always recall with pleasure. He had caught the ball too high on the bat, and I just missed the catch. "Dash it all!" I said irritably, and was about to resume bowling, when I noticed that he was unhappy. He hesitated, took up his position at the wicket, and then came to me manfully. "I am a cad," he said in distress, "for when the ball was in the air I prayed." He had prayed that I should miss the catch, and, as I think I have already told you, it is considered unfair in the Gardens to pray for victory. My splendid David! He has the faults of other little boys, but he has a noble sense of fairness. "We shall call it a no ball, David," I said gravely. "I suppose the suspense of the reader is now painful, and therefore I shall say it was that David won the match with 2 lovely fours, the one over my head and the other to leg all along the ground. When I came back from fielding this last ball I found him embracing his bat, and to my sour congratulations he could at first reply only with hysterical sounds. But soon he was pelting home to his mother with his glorious news. And that is how we let Barbara in. End of chapter 25.